Imagine standing in the heart of the Arabian Peninsula in the year 1732, where the landscape stretches endlessly in every direction, vast, unforgiving, and utterly magnificent. The dunes rise and fall like the breathing of some ancient sleeping creature, and the heat shimmers above the sand in waves that seem to ripple toward the horizon itself. Here, in this vast expanse, a small clan called the al-Saud family tends to their herds, moves with the seasons, and lives much like countless other Bedouin tribes scattered across the desert have lived for centuries before them. They are not kings, they are not wealthy, they are not destined, at least not yet, for anything beyond the ordinary patterns of desert life. And yet, somewhere in the intricate web of history, economics, and remarkable human ambition, this single family, these desert shepherds and traders, would eventually become stewards of perhaps the most transformative resource the modern world has ever known. The question that draws us into this story is one that might seem almost impossible to answer when you truly contemplate it. How does a family of Bedouin herders and regional traders become the architects of a global economic empire that shapes energy markets, political alliances, and the daily lives of billions of people across the entire world? What series of meetings, decisions, circumstances, and choices had to align, almost like the turning of a vast celestial machine, to place this one dynasty at the center of such immense power and wealth? If you find yourself drawn to stories of how empires rise from humble beginnings, how fortunes transform entire civilizations, and how the currents of history sweep up ordinary people into extraordinary circumstances, I'd invite you to subscribe to this channel. We create extended documentaries designed to be listened to as you drift towards sleep, exploring the deep stories behind some of the world's most influential nations, families, and movements. Each episode is built to teach you something genuinely meaningful while allowing your mind to settle into a gentle, restful state. Now, let us travel back through the centuries and meet the al-Saud family in their earliest days, long before oil, before nations, before the modern world announced itself across the sands of Arabia. The story we are about to trace is not one of inevitable triumph. History rarely works that way. Instead, it is a story of alliances made and broken, of religious conviction that runs deeper than blood itself, of political genius applied in an unlikely place, and of a natural resource so powerful that it would eventually rewrite the economic foundations of the entire modern world. The Nejd region, where the al-Saud family made their home, is located in the central highlands of the Arabian Peninsula. It is not the most hospitable corner of their homeland. The summers are scorching. The winters, while less severe than other seasons, still carry the bite of a desert chill. Water is precious, scarce in fact, and the land sustains life only through intimate knowledge passed down through generations, through patience, through an understanding of where to find what little water exists, where the grazing grounds hide in certain seasons, which routes across the dunes lead toward trade and survival. The Bedouin who inhabited this region had developed, over centuries, a deeply sophisticated knowledge system. They understood their environment with a precision that only comes from generations of necessity and observation. The al-Saud family, in these early generations, were regional players of moderate significance. They held some land, some influence within the tribal hierarchies that governed the peninsula at that time. They engaged in trade. They bred horses and camels. They gathered what resources they could from a challenging landscape. But there was nothing in their circumstances, nothing obvious at least, that suggested they would one day command unimaginable wealth and global influence. The world in the early 18th century was not predicting their future, and yet, within the next 2 centuries, the descendants of these desert dwellers would become one of the most powerful families in human history. This transformation would not come from military conquest alone, though conflict would certainly play its role. It would not come from the discovery of oil in their lands. That particular fortune, remarkable as it is, would come much later, and in ways that might surprise you. The true beginning of the Saud dynasty's rise traces back to something far more subtle and perhaps far more powerful. An alliance made in the middle of the 18th century between the al-Saud family and a religious reformer whose ideas would fundamentally reshape their entire approach to governance, power, and cultural identity. The reformer's name was Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab. He was born in 1703 in a small town called Uyayna, not far from where the al-Saud family maintained their base of operations. Abd al-Wahhab's life was devoted to religious scholarship and theological study. He traveled widely throughout the Islamic world, studying in various centers of Islamic learning, absorbing knowledge, debating with scholars, and gradually developing a particular interpretation of Islamic faith and practice. He became convinced, and this is a crucial point for understanding everything that would follow, that Islamic society had drifted away from what he saw as the pure, original teachings of the Prophet Muhammad. He witnessed what he perceived as the veneration of saints, the building of elaborate shrines, the use of intermediaries in religious practice, and numerous other customs that he came to believe contradicted the fundamental message of his faith. Abd al-Wahhab returned to Uyayna with a mission: to reform Islamic practice in Arabia, to return the faith to what he understood as its original purity and simplicity. His teachings were austere, his vision was uncompromising, and his ideas, while drawing from legitimate Islamic scholarship, represented a departure from many of the customs and practices that had become embedded in Arabian religious life over centuries. Some people found his message compelling and pure. Others found it threatening to traditions they held dear. The religious and political authorities in various regions of Arabia took notice, and not always approvingly. This is where history contains one of its most consequential coincidences, or perhaps it is better described as a meeting of two powerful forces at precisely the right moment. Around the year 1745, at an age when Abd al-Wahhab's reformist vision had already encountered resistance and difficulty in various communities, he came into contact with Muhammad ibn Saud, the leader of the al-Saud family at that particular moment in their history. What happened between these two men, and we must acknowledge here that the historical record provides us with interpretations that vary depending on the source and the perspective, appears to have been a meeting of mutual recognition and ambition. Muhammad ibn Saud was an intelligent political operator. He recognized that Abd al-Wahhab's religious message, combined with the organizational and spiritual power it could generate, might serve as a foundation for expanding Saud authority and influence throughout the peninsula. Abd al-Wahhab, for his part, appears to have recognized that Muhammad ibn Saud possessed the political and military capacity to help spread his religious vision across a much broader territory than he could accomplish alone. Whether this partnership emerged from purely ideological alignment, or from a more pragmatic calculation of mutual benefit, or most likely from some combination of both, the two men entered into an alliance that would prove to be transformative. They formalized an agreement, the exact terms of which, like many historical documents from this period, exist in various interpreted forms that bound their fates together. The essential understanding appears to have been this: Muhammad ibn Saud would support Abd al-Wahhab's religious teachings and help establish them throughout his territory, while Abd al-Wahhab's religious legitimacy would support Muhammad ibn Saud's political authority and ambitions for expansion. It was, in essence, a fusion of religious conviction and political pragmatism, of spiritual authority and military power. This combination would prove extraordinarily effective. What emerged from this partnership, gradually at first and then with increasing momentum, was a movement that combined religious reform with territorial expansion. The Saud family, now armed not only with the practical authority that came from military and administrative capability, but also with the spiritual authority that came from association with Abd al-Wahhab's vision of Islamic purity, began to consolidate power throughout the Nejd region and eventually far beyond it. The movement became known, in its various forms, as Wahhabism, a term that would carry significant weight, both positive and negative, throughout subsequent centuries of history. And so we see, in the middle of the 18th century, the true beginning of what would eventually become the House of Saud as a serious force in the Arabian Peninsula. It would take generations. It would involve conflicts and setbacks. It would encounter resistance from established powers and from those who held different religious or political visions for their region. But the foundation was laid, quietly, in the dust of the desert, in the meeting between a religious reformer and a political operator who recognized in each other the potential to reshape their world. To understand how the House of Saud came to command such extraordinary power, we must travel backward through time to the 18th century, to a period when the Arabian Peninsula was not a unified nation, but rather a vast, sparsely inhabited expanse of desert, tribal territories, and competing claims. The sand itself was the dominant force, harsh, unforgiving, shaping the rhythms of life for the Bedouin peoples who had roamed these lands for millennia. And among those tribes, in the central Nejd region, there existed a family whose name would eventually echo across continents and centuries. The al-Saud family, as historians trace them, were not initially distinguished by wealth or military might. They were notable landowners and minor tribal leaders in the town of Diriyah, a modest settlement built where two seasonal water valleys converged, a rare blessing in that part of the world. For generations they held influence within their immediate sphere, gaining respect through commerce and careful marriage alliances, the ancient way that power consolidated itself in the desert. They were, in essence, one family among many, their ambitions provincial rather than imperial. Yet something shifted in the early 1700s, a moment of convergence that would alter the trajectory of their lineage forever. In 1744, a remarkable meeting occurred between Muhammad ibn Saud, the tribal leader of Diriyah at that time, and Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab, a religious reformer who had spent years traveling, studying Islamic texts, and becoming increasingly convinced that Muslim societies had strayed from the pure, original teachings of Islam. Al-Wahhab preached what he called Tawheed, absolute monotheism, a return to strict adherence to the Quran and the practices of the earliest Muslims. He rejected what he saw as the corrupting influences of folk religion, the veneration of saints, elaborate tomb shrines, and the accumulation of centuries of cultural practices he deemed un-Islamic. Does it seem strange that a political alliance began with a theological argument? Perhaps, but such was the nature of power in the Arabian world, where religious authority and temporal authority were deeply intertwined, each legitimizing the other. What made this partnership so consequential was precisely this fusion. Muhammad ibn Saud, a shrewd political operator, recognized that al-Wahhab's religious message offered him something far more valuable than military force alone could provide: moral legitimacy. If he could align himself with a puritanical, reformist interpretation of Islam, he could appeal not merely to local tribal interests, but to a broader Islamic conscience. Meanwhile, al-Wahhab needed a protector, a strong political arm to help spread his message. The alliance was thus sealed, through self-interest married to ideology, a combination that has often proven remarkably durable in human affairs. The relationship between these two men established a pattern that would define the House of Saud for centuries to come: the intertwining of political authority with religious authority, a covenant between the temporal and the sacred. The al-Saud family would be the custodians of state power, while Wahhabi Islam would be the moral and spiritual framework that justified that power and gave it meaning. This was not unique in Islamic history. Similar patterns had emerged elsewhere, but the particular way it crystallized in the Nejd proved extraordinarily resilient and eventually extraordinarily successful. From Diriyah, the al-Saud Wahhabi movement began to expand outward. Through the latter half of the 18th century, using a combination of missionary zeal and military conquest, they gradually brought more and more of the Arabian Peninsula under their control. Neighboring towns and tribes either embraced the Wahhabi interpretation of Islam, or they resisted and faced military pressure. The movement spread with surprising speed, driven partly by genuine religious conviction among believers, partly by the tactical advantages that centralized religious authority provided, and partly simply by the momentum that any growing power tends to accumulate. By the early 1800s, the first Saudi state, what historians call the Diriyah state, had extended its authority across much of central and eastern Arabia. Pilgrims traveling to the holy cities of Mecca and Medina found themselves in territory controlled by the al-Saud family and their Wahhabi allies. This presented both an opportunity and a problem. The opportunity lay in the prestige and revenue that came from controlling the pilgrimage routes. The problem was that the Ottoman Empire, which held nominal sovereignty over the Arabian Peninsula at that time, viewed this rising power as a threat to imperial authority and religious orthodoxy alike. The Ottomans, after all, represented a more moderate, more cosmopolitan interpretation of Islam, one that had accommodated centuries of accumulated traditions, shrine veneration, and Sufi mysticism. To the Ottoman establishment, the Wahhabis seemed like dangerous Puritans, disrupting the carefully maintained order of the Muslim world. The tension between these competing visions of Islamic authority came to a head in the second decade of the 19th century. Concerned about the expanding influence of the al-Saud Wahhabi movement, and perhaps sensing a challenge to imperial legitimacy, the Ottoman Sultan ordered his viceroy in Egypt to mount a military expedition into the Arabian interior. What followed was a series of campaigns, brutal and prolonged, that gradually overwhelmed the Diriyah state. By 1818, after years of siege and warfare, the Saudi capital fell. The al-Saud family was scattered, their power apparently broken, their great-grandfather's vision seemingly extinguished before it had truly flourished on a broader stage. And yet, as is often the case with powerful ideas combined with entrenched family interests, the story did not end there. The fall of Diriyah did not mean the end of Saudi ambition or of Wahhabi Islam. Rather, it was a setback, painful and humbling, but not final. The family regrouped, rebuilt, and the long process of consolidation began again. What might seem like a catastrophic defeat from the perspective of any single moment appeared, when viewed from the vantage point of longer timescales, more like an interruption in an ongoing narrative. The House of Saud possessed something that transcended military capability or immediate political advantage. It possessed a vision, a network of religious and tribal loyalty, and perhaps most importantly, a family structure oriented toward long-term thinking. They did not expect to rule forever without challenge. They expected, instead, to navigate challenges, to adapt, and to endure. And so it was that Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab, a scholar born in Uyayna in the early 18th century, began to see the world around him not as it was, but as it ought to be. He had traveled, studied in Damascus and Medina, absorbed the teachings of stricter Islamic traditions, and returned home with a vision that would reshape an entire peninsula. Wahhab looked at the practices of his contemporaries, the veneration of saints, the elaborate rituals that had accumulated over centuries, the slow drift toward what he perceived as spiritual compromise, and he grew convinced that Islam had strayed far from its original purity. His teachings, though they began as gentle theological corrections in small gatherings, soon became a manifesto for reform. He spoke of a return to fundamentals, to the Quran and Sunnah as interpreted in their most literal, most unadorned form. It was a powerful message in a time of fragmentation, when the Ottoman Empire's grip on the Arabian Peninsula had grown loose and distant, when local tribes answered to themselves more than to any distant sultan. Now, it would be easy to imagine that Wahhab's ideas spread like wildfire through sheer spiritual fervor alone, but human history rarely unfolds that way. Ideas need vessels, and power needs allies. Around the middle of the 18th century, Wahhab encountered a man named Muhammad ibn Saud, a tribal leader of modest means but considerable ambition, ruling from the small settlement of Diriyah in the Najd region. What happened between these two figures, whether it was a formal covenant or a gradual alignment born from mutual necessity, remains somewhat obscured by time and the nature of oral tradition, but what emerged was one of history's most consequential partnerships. Ibn Saud saw in Wahhab's teachings both spiritual legitimacy and political utility. A religious movement could unify fractured tribes in a way that mere conquest never could. To wage war under the banner of Islamic reform was not brigandage, it was a righteous cause. This alliance, forged in the dusty interior of the Arabian Peninsula, far from the centers of Ottoman power, would prove to be the birth moment of something entirely new. The combination of Wahhab's theological vision and Ibn Saud's political will created a framework that would eventually dominate an entire region. When you think about how nations form, you often imagine armies and diplomacy, grand gestures and formal declarations. But sometimes a nation begins when one man offers a pure vision of faith and another man sees in it the tool to build a dynasty. Together, they began what would be called the First Saudi State, a political and religious entity unified by a single doctrine, governed by a single family, and propelled by the conviction that they alone understood the true path. The first campaigns were modest in scale, but significant in their intent. Armed bands of followers, united by religious zeal and tribal loyalty, moved outward from Diriyah, bringing other settlements and tribes under the banner of this new religious political order. Towns that resisted were subdued. Leaders who submitted were incorporated into the growing structure. It was not quick, and it was not painless, but it was inexorable. By the late 18th century, the Saudi Wahhabi state had expanded to control vast portions of the Najd, the central plateau of Arabia. They moved toward the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, toward the sacred heart of Islam itself. Can you imagine the audacity of it? Or perhaps the inevitability? A regional power, animated by a reform movement, pushing toward the very places where Islamic authority was traditionally rooted. The Ottoman Empire, which had ruled these territories nominally for centuries, found itself suddenly confronted with a genuine threat. A provincial governor cannot simply ignore a rising force that begins to challenge the legitimacy of Islamic practice within Islam's most sacred sites. The Ottoman response came in the early 19th century, and it was, by the standards of the time, overwhelming. An army was dispatched from Egypt under the command of Muhammad Ali Pasha, a figure of considerable military talent and ambition himself. What followed was a prolonged campaign, sometimes called a jihad against the Wahhabis, though such terminology is contested by historians. The conflict lasted years, involved multiple engagements across the peninsula, and ultimately resulted in the destruction of Diriyah itself. The capital was besieged, its walls were breached, and the first Saudi state, after roughly a century of expansion, collapsed into ruin. It would be natural to assume that this military defeat marked an ending, the final chapter in the story of a brief and ultimately failed experiment. Yet what makes human history so endlessly layered is that endings are often disguises for transformations. The political entity may have been destroyed, but the ideology, the family, and the ambition had taken root too deeply to be merely erased. The House of Saud scattered, some members imprisoned, some exiled, but the bonds of family and faith held. Within a generation, They had reconstituted themselves in a different form, in a different location. Geography in the Arabian Peninsula, you must understand, is not merely about coordinates on a map. It is about proximity to trade routes, access to water, defensibility, and symbolic significance. The Saud family, in their period of restoration, would gradually move their base toward the eastern portions of the Najd, toward a place that would eventually become Riyadh. And there, in the 19th century, in a region far from the centers of Ottoman power and international attention, they would begin again, more patiently this time, more strategically, waiting for the world to change in ways that would ultimately serve their interests far more completely than even their ancestors could have imagined. The turning point arrived not through conquest or clever diplomacy alone, but through something far more subtle, a covenant, one might say, whispered across the desert and sealed through shared conviction. In the year 1744, in a small oasis settlement, a remarkable figure emerged from the tribal mists, Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab, a religious scholar whose ideas would reshape not just the Saud family's destiny, but the spiritual landscape of the Islamic world itself. This was not a chance meeting, though history often presents it that way. Rather, it was two visions, two ambitions, finding each other in the precise moment they needed to align. Abd al-Wahhab came bearing a message that resonated deeply within the Arabian consciousness, a call to return to what he saw as the pure, uncorrupted Islam of the earliest generations. He preached against what he termed the creeping corruptions of his time, the veneration of saints, the elaborate shrine cults, the layers of interpretation that had accumulated like dust across centuries of Islamic scholarship. His vision was austere, uncompromising, and, to many, profoundly clarifying. When Muhammad ibn Saud, the patriarch of the Saud family at that time, encountered Abd al-Wahhab's teachings, something crystallized. Here was not merely a spiritual philosophy, but a unifying force, a banner beneath which scattered tribes might gather not out of fear or obligation, but out of conviction. The alliance they forged, one between the political ambitions of the Saud family and the spiritual authority of the Wahhabi interpretation, became the foundation upon which an entire empire would eventually rise. It was a partnership of remarkable durability, one that has endured, in various forms, to the present day. The scholar provided legitimacy, the family provided structure, organization, military strength. Together, they offered something that had long been absent from the Arabian Peninsula, a coherent identity, a sense of purpose that transcended clan loyalties and tribal boundaries. What followed was not immediate conquest, but rather a gradual, methodical expansion. Throughout the latter half of the 18th century, the Saud Wahhabi movement spread outward from their base, drawing followers through a combination of military victories and genuine appeal to those who embraced the reformist message. Imagine, if you will, the perspective of a Bedouin trader or settled farmer in those centuries, watching the movements of power shift across the landscape, hearing stories of this new alliance that promised not just strength, but spiritual renewal. For many, it was compelling. The movement offered both temporal security and eternal purpose, a rare and potent combination. The Saudi forces, energized by religious conviction and led by increasingly capable commanders, began to dominate the central Najd region and then expanded their influence toward the edges of the peninsula. By the end of the 1700s, the First Saudi State, as historians call it, controlled vast territories and held considerable sway over the holy cities themselves. Mecca and Medina, those supreme centers of Islamic devotion, fell within the Saudi sphere of influence. This was not without tremendous significance. To control or influence the two holiest cities in Islam meant possessing both spiritual and practical leverage across the entire Muslim world. Pilgrims came to those cities from every corner of the Islamic realm, carrying back with them accounts of what they witnessed, tales that would spread influence far beyond the peninsula itself. Yet power, as it so often does, invited resistance. The Ottoman Empire, which had long held nominal sovereignty over much of the Islamic world, could not remain indifferent to the rise of this new force in Arabia. The Ottomans, themselves stretched thin across vast territories from North Africa to the Caucasus, nonetheless perceived the Saud Wahhabi movement as a threat to their authority and to the more orthodox interpretations of Islam that they championed. This was the beginning of a long and complex relationship, sometimes adversarial, sometimes pragmatic, between the House of Saud and the Ottoman throne. In the early 1800s, the Ottomans commissioned a military campaign against the Saudi state. They dispatched forces under Muhammad Ali of Egypt, one of the Ottoman Empire's most capable generals, with orders to suppress what they saw as a troublesome uprising. These were not merely skirmishes or minor raids. They were sustained military campaigns involving thousands of soldiers, artillery, and the full resources of a major imperial power. The first Saudi state, despite its growing strength and the fervent commitment of its followers, could not withstand such pressure indefinitely. By around 1818, the Saudi state collapsed under the weight of Ottoman military might, its territory fragmented, its leadership displaced or captured. But something crucial had shifted during those decades of the first Saudi state's existence. The Saud family had transformed from regional players into a force with genuine historical consequence. The Wahhabi interpretation of Islam, meanwhile, had spread its roots deeper into Arabian soil and beyond. These were not seeds that could easily be replanted once scattered. When the Ottoman forces withdrew, as they eventually did, unable to maintain permanent occupation of such remote and difficult terrain, the conditions remained for renewal, for regrowth. The relationship between the Saud family and the religious movement that had elevated them was tested but not broken. It was merely waiting, dormant like the desert itself in the dry season, for the circumstances that would permit its resurrection. It was in the vast, pitiless desert of the Nejd, far inland from the coastal trade routes where easier fortunes could be made, that one man's vision would begin to reshape the world in ways neither he nor his contemporaries could have imagined. Muhammad ibn Saud, the founder of what would become the House of Saud, inherited not a kingdom but a modest settlement, al-Diriyah, positioned at the convergence of wadis, those dry riverbeds that occasionally filled with life-giving water. His domain was small, his resources limited, and the political landscape around him was fragmented into countless tribal allegiances and shifting territorial claims. Yet there was something in his temperament, something in the way he perceived the possibilities of his position, that suggested he understood a truth about power in that time and place, that in a region of spiritual longing and religious uncertainty, the man who could ally himself with authentic religious reform might find a path to something greater than wealth or conquest alone. Enter now into the picture one of history's most significant and curiously underappreciated figures, Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab. He was a scholar, a theologian, a man who had traveled widely through the Islamic world and returned to his birthplace in the Nejd, deeply troubled by what he perceived as centuries of spiritual corruption. In his view, Islam had become obscured beneath layers of folk practice, saint veneration, and compromise with local customs. He advocated for a return to what he believed was the pure, unadorned faith of the earliest Islamic communities, a kind of religious fundamentalism that would strip away, as he saw it, all the accumulated error of ages. It was a message that resonated deeply in the austere, unforgiving landscape of the desert, where simplicity and directness were not merely aesthetic preferences, but the very conditions of survival. When these two men met, and here the precise details grow somewhat clouded by time and by the nature of oral tradition, something remarkably consequential took shape. It was as though two currents had collided and merged. Saud saw in al-Wahhab's religious vision a source of legitimacy and moral authority that no purely political claim could ever provide. And al-Wahhab, who was far more comfortable with theological argument than with the mechanics of governance, found in Saud a protector and an instrument through which his ideas could spread beyond the confines of scholarly debate and into the actual lives and practices of men and women across the peninsula. Their partnership, sealed by marriage ties as was customary, created a bond that would prove far more durable than any mere political alliance. What emerged from this marriage of convenience and conviction was revolutionary, though perhaps not in the way that term is typically understood. The movement that took shape around them was not one of armed rebellion against established empires, at least not at first, but rather a methodical, religiously justified expansion of Saud's influence throughout the surrounding territories. Communities were given a choice, really, though the choice was framed in the simplest possible terms: accept the reformed Islam of al-Wahhab and the protection of Saud's growing forces, or resist and face the consequences of that resistance. To many who lived under the ineffective or corrupt rule of distant Ottoman governors, the proposition held genuine appeal. The 18th century, as it unfolded across the Arabian Peninsula, was a period of relative fragmentation. The Ottoman Empire, once the supreme power throughout the Islamic world, had begun a long, slow process of decline, though that decline was gradual enough that many centuries of effective dominance still remained ahead. Local rulers and tribal chiefs held varying degrees of autonomy. Into this environment of dispersed authority and theological uncertainty, the Wahhabi Saud movement began to expand with surprising momentum. Towns and villages that had never paid more than nominal tribute to distant powers found themselves suddenly incorporated into something new, a state that was at once religious in its ideology and increasingly sophisticated in its administrative structures. Consider how different this must have felt to ordinary people living in those settlements. For generations, authority had been a distant, often invisible thing. The Ottoman Sultan existed in Constantinople or Istanbul, an abstract figure whose power touched your life mainly through tax collectors and occasional military conscription. But now, here were men who spoke the language of religious renewal, who pointed to specific practices and said, "These are wrong, these must cease." They built mosques and encouraged new standards of pious behavior. They appointed administrators who reported to a central authority. They promised order, spiritual clarity, and protection in exchange for obedience and a share of resources. For many, especially those who had grown weary of chaos or felt spiritually unmoored, it must have seemed like the answer to a prayer. By the time Muhammad ibn Abd died in 1765, the principality he had helped to establish controlled a significant portion of the Nejd, but perhaps more importantly, the ideology he had embraced and the religious legitimacy it provided had taken root in a way that mere political power never could. When his son, Abd al-Aziz, inherited the leadership of the state, he inherited not just a territory, but a movement with moral and spiritual momentum. The question that now hung in the air, unanswered and almost unexamined by those living through it, was this: what would happen when a state founded on such rigid religious principles began to encounter the complexities and compromises that all actual governance requires? The expansion continued under Abd al-Aziz with even greater momentum and ambition than before. Where Saud had been cautious and tactical, sometimes even content with spiritual influence without territorial control, his son pursued the consolidation of actual power with remarkable determination. The Wahhabi message of religious purification was no longer just an ideological framework. It was becoming the justification for conquest. Towns resisted. Cities that had their own traditions of Islamic learning questioned whether al-Wahhab's interpretations were truly superior to their own. Battles were fought. The methods became increasingly coercive, even as the rhetoric remained rooted in pious intention. Yet there is a curious tension that historians have long noted in studying this period. The expansion was rapid and militarily effective, but it also generated significant opposition. There were those who saw the Wahhabi state not as a return to authentic Islam, but as a distortion of it, a puritanical interpretation that stripped Islam of beauty, of poetry, of the rich spiritual traditions that had developed over centuries. Scholars in other parts of the Islamic world, particularly in Egypt and the Ottoman heartland, began to develop counter-arguments, to marshal their own theological resources against what they saw as the narrowness and rigidity of Wahhabi thought. The question of who truly spoke for authentic Islam was not a new one, but it was becoming more urgent, more contested, more intertwined with questions of political power and territorial control than it had been in centuries. By the final decades of the 18th century, the House of Saud and its Wahhabi allies controlled territories that encompassed perhaps 3/4 of the Arabian Peninsula. It was an extraordinary achievement in just a few generations of expansion. The dusty, simple settlement of Diriyah had become the center of a genuine state with administrative structures, military forces, and ideological reach. Yet this very success, this rapid ascent from provincial obscurity to regional dominance, was beginning to create problems that no amount of religious fervor could solve. By the early 1920s, Abdul Aziz ibn Saud had already earned a reputation as a warrior of remarkable precision and patience. A man who understood that empires are not built through conquest alone, but through the slow architecture of alliance and strategic marriage. He had already begun to consolidate his power across the Nejd, the vast central plateau of the Arabian Peninsula, and with each victory came not only new territory, but new families bound to his through blood and obligation. The desert, in many ways, had taught him that survival depends on networks of loyalty, woven as carefully as the threads of a Bedouin's tent. It was during this period of consolidation that Abdul Aziz encountered a force that would prove far more transformative than any rival warrior or tribal confederation. In 1922, he was introduced to the teachings of Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab, a religious reformer whose ideas had, by then, been dormant and scattered for nearly 2 centuries. The connection between the House of Saud and Wahhabism, as it came to be called, is often described as a marriage of convenience, yet that characterization perhaps undersells the profound legitimacy it granted to Abdul Aziz's expanding realm. Through Wahhabi interpretation, his military campaigns were recast not merely as tribal expansion, but as a religious purification, a return to what followers believed was a purer form of Islam, stripped of what they saw as centuries of accumulated practices and veneration that had strayed from the Prophet's original teachings. This ideology gave Abdul Aziz's warriors a sense of sacred purpose that transcended the usual motivations of tribal conquest. The soldiers who rode beneath his banners were no longer simply bound by kinship or the promise of plunder, but by the conviction that they were fighting to restore true faith. Imagine for a moment the psychological shift this creates within an army. Fatigue becomes sacrifice, hardship becomes penance, victory becomes vindication. The Ikhwan, as these religiously motivated fighters came to be known, formed warrior brotherhoods that moved across the Arabian Peninsula with a fervor that alarmed both the Ottoman Empire, which still nominally controlled much of the region, and the emerging British Empire, which had begun to cast its shadow across the Middle East through colonial arrangements and strategic treaties. By the 1920s, the political landscape of the Arabian Peninsula was entering a period of rapid transformation. The Ottoman Empire, which had governed loosely but persistently for centuries, was fragmenting in the aftermath of the First World War. The British, having emerged victorious from that conflict, found themselves the dominant foreign power in the region. They had already established protectorates over Kuwait and other coastal territories, and they were intensely interested in who would ultimately control the interior of Arabia. Abdulaziz recognized, with the kind of shrewd political instinct that marks truly consequential leaders, that aligning himself with the British, or at least not antagonizing them, was essential to his long-term survival. He was careful, methodical, and always aware that the world beyond the desert had acquired technological and military advantages that could easily overwhelm a purely traditional power base. The consolidation of power within the Arabian Peninsula occurred with remarkable speed during the 1920s and early 1930s. One by one, the rival powers that had resisted Abdulaziz's expansion either submitted to his authority or were defeated militarily. The Hashemites, who had long held the holy cities of Mecca and Medina and who claimed descent from the Prophet Muhammad's family, had once seemed unassailable. Yet even they proved vulnerable to the combination of Ikhwan ferocity and Abdulaziz's political sagacity. By 1925, the Hashemites had been driven from the Hijaz, the western region of Arabia, containing Islam's two holiest cities. This victory had enormous symbolic weight. It was not simply the conquest of cities or territory, but the acquisition of religious authority within the Islamic world. Abdulaziz, a Bedouin warrior whose claim to prominence had begun in the interior deserts, now controlled the very heartland of Islamic pilgrimage and belief. Yet with this triumph came a profound tension that would reverberate through the remainder of his reign and far beyond. The Ikhwan, the religious warriors who had made much of Abdulaziz's expansion possible, had grown into a powerful force with their own expectations and ideology. They had proven themselves in battle, had demonstrated unwavering commitment to their religious vision, and they naturally expected to exert significant influence over how their newly consolidated kingdom would be governed. Abdulaziz, however, was developing increasingly pragmatic relationships with foreign powers, particularly the British, relationships that the Ikhwan viewed with suspicion and often outright hostility. The very tool that had built the kingdom, a warrior class united by religious conviction, was beginning to threaten its stability and evolution. This tension between puritanical religious fervor and the practical necessities of governing a modern state, even in its infancy, would become one of the defining challenges of the Saudi kingdom's formation and would echo through decades of subsequent history. The discovery of oil in 1938 would transform everything, though few understood it at that moment. A small crew from the California Standard Oil Company had been drilling in the eastern desert, in a region called Daman, where the sand stretched endlessly beneath a merciless sun. When the first substantial quantities of crude began to flow from the ground, it was as though time itself had shifted. The kingdom suddenly possessed something the modern world desperately wanted, something that would make its rulers incomparably wealthy within a single generation. Abdulaziz, now in his 50s, began to grasp the magnitude of what lay beneath his feet, though the full scope of that fortune would take years to unfold. The relationship between the Saudi kingdom and the Western oil companies evolved slowly at first, shaped by careful negotiation and mutual need. American geologists and engineers began to arrive in greater numbers, establishing camps in the desert, bringing with them technologies that seemed almost miraculous to those who had never seen an oil derrick or a modern drilling operation. The kingdom granted concessions, sold rights to explore and extract, and in return, received royalties that began to flow into the royal treasury. It was a transaction that seemed reasonable at the time, though history would later question whether those early terms truly reflected the value of what was being exchanged. The oil beneath Saudi Arabia would prove to be among the most abundant reserves on Earth, a resource of almost immeasurable strategic importance. By the 1940s, as the Second World War raged across Europe and the Pacific, oil had begun to reshape the kingdom's economy and its standing in the world. The American presence grew more visible, more established. Aramco, the Arabian American Oil Company, emerged as a dominant force, a corporate entity that held the keys to development and wealth. What had been a purely religious kingdom, bound by Islamic law and tribal tradition, was now beginning to absorb a different kind of influence. Modern infrastructure followed the oil. Roads were built, ports were expanded. The clash between tradition and modernity, which had simmered quietly for decades, was about to intensify. Abd al-Aziz navigated this transformation with a pragmatism that both enriched and complicated his legacy. He welcomed the economic benefits while attempting to preserve Islamic values and royal authority. The king understood that sudden wealth could destabilize a society as easily as it could elevate it. He began to distribute resources to his sons, establishing a system of governance that would rely on them as governors and ministers in the provinces and capital. This deliberate strategy, which has persisted in Saudi governance until very recently, created a structure where power was shared among the family while remaining firmly within the hands of the House of Saud. It was a system designed for stability, though it would eventually become weighted with complexity. The first major test of this new arrangement came in 1945, when Abd al-Aziz traveled to Egypt to meet with President Franklin D. Roosevelt aboard an American warship in the Suez Canal. The image of the aged Arab king, dressed in his traditional robes, shaking hands with the American president, symbolized a shift in global alignments. The meeting was brief but consequential. The two leaders discussed mutual interests, oil supplies, and security arrangements. An implicit bargain was struck, one that would define Saudi-American relations for generations. The United States would provide military protection and diplomatic support to the Saudi kingdom, while Saudi Arabia would ensure the steady flow of oil to the West. It was a transaction far larger in scope than any oil concession, a strategic partnership forged in the aftermath of global war. The years that followed saw oil revenues accelerate. Where the kingdom had received modest royalties in the late 1930s, by the 1950s, the sums had grown to numbers that seemed almost abstract in their magnitude. Wealth poured into the state coffers faster than it could easily be spent or absorbed. Abd al-Aziz lived to see the beginning of this transformation, though he would not witness its full flowering. He died in 1953, at an age somewhere between 88 and 91, the precise year of his birth having been uncertain his entire life. He left behind a kingdom utterly transformed from the one he had first unified, a state that was no longer merely a regional power bound by Islamic authority and Bedouin tradition, but a global player in the emerging order of the 20th century. The succession was complicated, but ultimately orderly. Abd al-Aziz had fathered more than 40 children, and he had deliberately cultivated a system where his eldest sons would assume leadership in turn. His son Saud became king, followed later by Faisal, then Khalid, then Fahd. Each transition was fraught with the potential for conflict, yet the family had internalized a principle of consensus that, while sometimes strained, prevented the open civil war that might have torn the kingdom apart. This mechanism, called the Allegiance Council in its modern form, emerged gradually as a way to manage succession among the royal family. It was governance by committee, by consultative agreement among senior princes, a system that balanced the need for authoritative rule with the practical reality of a large, complex family holding enormous power. Under these successive leaders, the kingdom continued its metamorphosis. Faisal, who effectively governed during much of the 1950s and ruled directly from 1964 to 1975, became the figure most associated with Saudi modernization and Islamic conservatism working in tandem. He invested in education, in hospitals, in infrastructure. He also supported Islamic causes internationally, funding the spread of Wahhabism and traditional Islamic teaching across the Muslim world. This dual commitment to modernization and to religious tradition would become a defining characteristic of Saudi governance. How could a nation simultaneously embrace new technologies, new systems of finance, new ways of living, while maintaining the strict religious values that had defined it? This tension would never be fully resolved, only managed, negotiated, and sometimes suppressed. By the 1950s, something extraordinary had begun to reshape the kingdom's consciousness entirely. The first commercial oil wells, struck years before, were now producing in earnest, and the revenues flowing back were modest at first, almost delicate in their arrival, but they carried with them a kind of promise that few had dared to imagine. Oil, black and viscous, drawn from the earth beneath the Nejdi sands, became a conversation in every majlis, in every corner of the realm where men gathered to drink coffee and contemplate the future. What had been a land defined by trade routes and pilgrimage was now becoming defined by something subterranean, something that required no camels to transport, no merchants to negotiate, only machinery, foreign expertise, and the simple geological fortune of sitting atop some of the world's largest reserves. King Abdulaziz, who had spent decades consolidating a tribal nation into something resembling a modern state, now found himself presiding over an altogether different kind of transformation. The old man, in his 70s by this time, recognized that the world had shifted beneath him once more, though perhaps more permanently than any shift before. The oil revenues required structure. They required ministries. They required a kind of administrative machinery that tribal councils alone could never manage. The very fabric of governance had to change, not because the king wished it to change, but because quantities of wealth beyond anyone's previous comprehension demanded it. Consider what this moment meant for a moment. A kingdom that had existed for mere decades, born from conquest and religious conviction and the remarkable will of a single man, was now flooded with international capital and foreign workers and technology that would have seemed like sorcery to the generation before. The American oil company Aramco, brought in to explore and eventually extract the crude, became almost like a parallel government within the government. Their engineers, their accountants, their foreign employees, creating a kind of enclave that introduced new ways of thinking, new ways of organizing labor, new possibilities, and new tensions all at once. Did the kingdom embrace this? Did it resist? The truth, as with most profound transformations, was far more complicated. The religious scholars were not entirely at ease. Wahhabism, the austere interpretation of Islam that had been woven into the kingdom's foundation, held certain views about modernization, about foreign influence, about the proper ordering of life. And yet necessity, that ancient persuader, began to soften some of the harder edges of orthodoxy. Oil derricks rose, roads were laid, foreigners arrived in increasing numbers, and gradually, almost imperceptibly, the austere desert kingdom began to develop a visible infrastructure of modernity. Electric lights appeared in Riyadh, a simple airport was constructed, the very shape of cities began to alter, though slowly, cautiously, as if the kingdom was learning to walk in new shoes while maintaining its balance on ancient ground. The tension between tradition and change became the defining struggle of this era, a tension that would echo through generations to come. How does a society rooted in desert simplicity and Islamic fundamentalism absorb the coming of oil wealth without losing its soul? How does it modernize without occidentalizing? These were not merely philosophical questions, they were existential ones, because every decision made during these years would shape whether Saudi Arabia could remain recognizably itself while becoming something entirely new. The family structure of the House of Saud itself began to feel the weight of this transition. King Abdulaziz, with his many wives and many children, estimates suggest he had over 30 sons alone, had not prepared his realm for clear succession. The question of who would follow him, who would hold the reins when he finally died, was not a simple matter of primogeniture, as in European traditions. The family was large, ambitious, and already developing different factions with different visions for what the kingdom should become. Some of the princes looked toward the west and saw possibility. Others looked in the same direction and saw contamination, a threat to the Islamic character of the state. This generational divide, incipient but already present, created currents of political energy that would eventually tear at the fabric of family unity in ways that none of them could foresee. And yet, in these particular years of the early 1950s, all of that remained somewhat muted, somewhat below the surface, because the presence of oil wealth was intoxicating enough to defer many confrontations. Money, that great silencer of discord, was beginning to flow, and it seemed possible that it might flow forever. Is it possible for a society to change so rapidly without fracturing? That question hung in the air, unasked perhaps, but present nonetheless, as the kingdom stood on the threshold of something it could not yet fully comprehend. The machinery of the industrial age was turning, and Saudi Arabia was caught in its gears, being pulled forward into a future that looked nothing like its past. By the 1970s, the kingdom had begun to transform in ways that would have seemed impossible to Abd al-Aziz in his final years. The oil revenues that had trickled into the royal treasury in the 1950s and 60s had become a torrent, a golden flood that reshaped not just the landscape, but the very fabric of what it meant to be Saudi. The Aramco concession, that original agreement signed in the 1930s under such different circumstances, had evolved into something neither the American negotiators nor the Saudi princes had quite imagined. The kingdom now held the largest proven reserves of oil on earth, and as global demand surged and prices climbed, the House of Saud found itself wielding a form of power that transcended military might or territorial conquest. They wielded the power of energy itself. King Faisal, who had steered the kingdom through the turbulent 1960s, now watched as his long-held vision of modernization began to accelerate beyond even his careful planning. He was a man of deep religious conviction, yet pragmatic in his approach to the Western technology and investment his kingdom so desperately needed. This tension, between the desire to preserve Islamic tradition and the irresistible momentum of industrial transformation, would come to define not just his reign, but the entire character of modern Saudi Arabia. It remains, in many ways, unresolved to this day. The oil boom created an almost surreal landscape of sudden wealth. Concrete rose from sand at a pace that seemed to defy the laws of physics and finance. Jeddah, the ancient Red Sea port, began to bristle with modern office towers. Riyadh, the inland capital that had been little more than a collection of mud brick compounds just decades earlier, started its transformation into a sprawling city of wide boulevards and glass-fronted palaces. The speed of this change meant that generations of Saudis lived through multiple worlds in a single lifetime. Their grandfathers had navigated by stars across empty dunes. Their fathers had negotiated with oil executives in concrete buildings, and they themselves were growing up amid shopping malls and international airports. Yet this transformation came with profound dislocations. The traditional Bedouin way of life, which had defined Arab society for thousands of years, began to dissolve in less than a generation. Bedouin tribes that had once roamed freely across the peninsula found themselves settling in towns, their children learning English in newly built schools instead of learning to read the signs of the desert. The social structure that had organized Saudi life for centuries, kinship networks, tribal hierarchies, religious authority, remained in place on the surface, but underneath, something fundamental was shifting. What do you do when the ground beneath your feet changes so completely that the knowledge passed down through generations suddenly seems almost quaint? The royal family, understanding this vulnerability, moved quickly to position themselves as mediators of change. They would modernize, yes, but always under the umbrella of Islamic tradition. They would build cities, yes, but ensure that mosques remained at the heart of every community. They would educate their children in Western universities, yes, but would ensure that Islamic law remained the foundation of governance. This careful balance was not always successful, and the tensions it created would rumble beneath the surface of Saudi society for decades to come. The oil revenues allowed the House of Saud to accomplish something that few ruling families in history have managed: to distribute wealth broadly enough to maintain social cohesion, at least in the short term. Saudi citizens, especially those in the major cities, began to experience rising standards of living. Healthcare improved dramatically, education expanded. Citizens of the kingdom could now travel abroad, something that had been rare before. Young Saudis went to universities in America, Europe, and the Middle East, returning with new ideas, new perspectives, and new questions about the way their society was organized. But this exposure to the wider world carried its own complications. Saudis studying in Cairo absorbed the ideas of Arab nationalism and secular modernization. Saudis in Beirut encountered existential philosophy and political critique. Saudis in London and New York saw societies where religious authority did not govern every aspect of law and custom. They returned home to a kingdom that remained, in law and in official ideology, fundamentally theocratic. How could one reconcile what one had learned abroad with what was expected at home? The question lingered, unanswered, in the minds of an entire generation of educated Saudis. Beneath the glittering surface of oil wealth and rapid construction, older anxieties persisted. The relationship between the House of Saud and the religious establishment remained delicate. The Wahhabi clerics, who had been such crucial allies to Abd al-Aziz centuries earlier, still held tremendous influence, particularly over matters of law and public morality. Yet now, there were competing visions of what Islam demanded. Some argued that modernization was compatible with Islamic faith. Others, a growing number as time went on, began to argue that the direction Saudi Arabia was taking represented a betrayal of Islam itself. The kingdom was becoming wealthy, certainly, but was it becoming more godly or less so? The question would eventually demand an answer, though not yet. For now, in the early 1970s, the boom continued, and such troubling questions could be quietly set aside. By the middle of the 20th century, the Arabian Peninsula had begun to transform in ways that would have seemed like fever dreams to the desert tribes of just a generation earlier. The oil wells that had been discovered and developed throughout the 1930s and 40s were producing wealth on a scale that was almost incomprehensible, and the Saudi royal family found themselves in possession of something far more valuable than any amount of gold or silver could ever be. The question that began to occupy the minds of the Al Saud leadership, particularly King Ibn Saud himself as he aged and contemplated his legacy, was not whether they had power, that was now undeniable, but rather how to maintain that power across generations, across an expanding family, and across a rapidly modernizing world that seemed to demand new skills, new perspectives, and new ways of governing that were entirely foreign to the Bedouin traditions upon which the kingdom had been built. Ibn Saud himself was growing older, his vision beginning to fade as he entered his 8th decade, and though he remained a commanding presence, the practical business of ruling had begun to shift toward his many sons. He had fathered more than 40 children across multiple wives, a practice entirely consistent with Islamic tradition and with the customs of Arabian nobility. And among these sons there were capable administrators, thoughtful strategists, and men of genuine intelligence. Yet there were also rivalries, ambitions that did not always align, and the fundamental challenge of succession that has toppled kingdoms and empires throughout human history. He had studied the rise and fall of other Arab leaders, had witnessed the instability that came from unclear lines of power, and he was determined that his own kingdom would not fracture into the kind of chaos that had claimed so many of his neighbors. The Saudis began to invest their oil revenues not merely in palaces and personal indulgences, though certainly those existed, but in the infrastructure of a modern state. Roads were being constructed across the empty desert. Hospitals were being built in cities that had previously known only the remedies of tradition and prayer. Schools were established, though carefully controlled ones, where young Saudis could learn mathematics, engineering, and the languages that would allow them to engage with the wider world. Electric power stations began to hum to life in the major cities. Ports were expanded. The machinery of government, which had once fit into the tent of a single man, began to expand and formalize itself into ministries, councils, and bureaucracies. This modernization was not without its tensions. There were those within the clerical establishment, the ulema and the religious scholars, who viewed many of these changes with deep suspicion. Electricity was not forbidden by Islam, and neither was modern medicine, but the rapid pace of Western influence that seemed to accompany every technological advancement was deeply troubling to those who saw the kingdom as a sacred trust to be guarded against contamination. It was during this period, in the years after the Second World War, that the relationship between Saudi Arabia and the United States began to crystallize into something more formal and strategic. American oil companies, particularly the Arabian American Oil Company, which had become known as Aramco, had been operating in the kingdom since the 1930s, and they had developed a kind of informal partnership with the Saudi state. The Americans needed access to the oil, and the Saudis needed the revenue and the technical expertise that the Americans could provide. But as the Cold War began to take shape, and as the Soviet Union emerged as a rival superpower, with its own designs on influence in the Middle East, the strategic calculation became more complex. The United States, led by President Harry Truman and later President Dwight D. Eisenhower, came to view Saudi Arabia not merely as a source of oil, but as a crucial ally in the containment of Soviet expansion. A stable, pro-Western Saudi Arabia, it was reasoned, could serve as a bulwark against communist influence in the region, and could help ensure that Middle Eastern oil resources remained accessible to American and Western interests. In 1945, President Truman met with King Ibn Saud aboard an American cruiser on the Great Bitter Lake in Egypt, a moment heavy with symbolism and practical consequence. The aging Saudi king, who had built his empire through the conquest of the Arabian Peninsula and through an unshakable commitment to Islam, was now engaging directly with the leader of the world's most powerful Western nation. The conversations that took place during that meeting, though the full details remain somewhat obscure in the historical record, seemed to establish a framework of mutual interest and support. The Americans would provide military protection and technical assistance. The Saudis would ensure stability in the region and reliable access to oil. It was a kind of grand bargain, unwritten perhaps, but clearly understood by both sides, and it would shape the geopolitics of the Middle East for decades to come. Yet even as this partnership was forming, there were forces at work that would complicate the relationship considerably. The discovery of vast oil reserves in Iran, under the control of a nationalist prime minister named Muhammad ibn, who had begun to challenge the British and American companies that had long dominated Iranian oil production, introduced an element of instability and uncertainty into regional calculations. When Mossadegh moved to nationalize the Iranian oil industry in 1951, he was applauded by many Arabs and Iranians as a visionary standing up to Western imperialism. But to the Americans and the British, he represented a threat to their strategic interests and, perhaps more importantly, a potential opening for Soviet influence in the region. The CIA and British intelligence services eventually organized a covert operation that resulted in Mossadegh's overthrow in 1953 and the restoration of the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, to full power in Iran. The Shah was far more amenable to Western interests, and he maintained close ties to both the United States and to Israel, a fact that would have significant consequences for Saudi Arabia and for Arab politics more broadly. The rise of the Shah as America's preferred partner in the Persian Gulf, created a curious dynamic. Saudi Arabia and Iran, the two largest oil-producing nations in the region, were now both aligned with Western interests, yet they were also competitors and rivals with a long history of tension between them. The Saudis were Sunni Muslims, descendants of the Arabian tribes, and the followers of the Prophet Muhammad's teachings, as interpreted through the traditional schools of Islamic jurisprudence. The Iranians, particularly under the Shah's rule, were predominantly Shia Muslims, with a different historical narrative and different approaches to religious authority and practice. The Persian-Arab divide, the Sunni-Shia divide, and the competition for regional influence created a kind of underlying friction that would periodically erupt into crises and conflicts. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, both nations continued to expand their oil production and to accumulate wealth, but they did so in different directions and with different visions for their societies and their role in the world. Within Saudi Arabia itself, the influx of oil wealth and the increasing contact with the outside world were creating social pressures and generational tensions. Young Saudis, who had been educated abroad, particularly in Egypt and in Western universities, were returning to the kingdom with ideas about modernization, about nationalism, and about more inclusive forms of governance. The spread of radio and, later, television meant that information and alternative ideologies could reach people in remote villages and desert towns who had previously been isolated from the wider currents of Arab and world politics. The Egyptian president Gamal Abdel Nasser, who had come to power in 1952 following a military coup, was becoming increasingly influential as a voice of Arab nationalism and anti-imperialism, and his message was resonating with many Saudis, particularly among the younger generation and among those who felt that the royal family's close alignment with the West was a betrayal of Arab and Islamic principles. The situation was further complicated by the ongoing Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which was creating deep divisions throughout the Arab world and was becoming an increasingly important factor in Saudi Arabian politics and policy. In 1956, when Israel, along with Britain and France, invaded Egypt in response to President Nasser's nationalization of the Suez Canal, the Saudis found themselves in a delicate position. They were aligned with the United States and Britain through their oil partnerships and security agreements. Yet the invasion of Egypt, a fellow Arab nation and a Muslim country, provoked genuine outrage among the Saudi population and among the clerical establishment. The king and the royal family had to balance their Western alliance against the demands of Arab solidarity and Islamic principle. The Suez Crisis, as it came to be known, exposed the tensions inherent in the Saudi position and raised questions about the long-term viability of their partnership with the West. How long could the kingdom maintain its close ties to Western powers while navigating the complex waters of Arab nationalism and Islamic identity? This question would haunt Saudi policymakers throughout the following decades, and it would shape the kingdom's diplomatic strategies, its military investments, and its internal security arrangements in profound and lasting ways. The architects of this new vision understood something fundamental about the nature of power in the 20th century. It was no longer sufficient to simply control land and people. You had to control something the world could not live without. And by the 1950s, as the American automobile culture spread across the globe like a great amber wave, petroleum had become the lifeblood of modern civilization. The Saudis possessed reserves so vast that geologists struggled to comprehend their magnitude, yet the kingdom remained, in many ways, a prisoner of its own wealth. Consider the peculiar predicament of absolute monarchy in an age of rapid transformation. King Abdulaziz, now aging into his final years, had built a state through coalition and compromise. But what happens when the ground itself begins to shift? The oil revenues that started as a trickle in the 1930s had become, by the 1950s, a torrential flow of capital unlike anything the region had ever witnessed. Aramco, the American Petroleum Consortium, pumped millions of barrels annually from the eastern deserts, and with each barrel came not merely profit, but a fundamental reshaping of the social order. The early oil years revealed a tension that would haunt the kingdom for decades to come. Western engineers and businessmen arrived in unprecedented numbers, bringing with them industrial methods, secular worldviews, and material cultures that seemed to contradict everything the kingdom's religious foundations stood upon. Here, in the heart of Islam's holiest land, stood oil derricks and foreign workers, air-conditioned compounds and modern machinery. The conservative clergy watched with growing unease, the merchant class watched with fascination and appetite, and Abdulaziz himself, now in his 70s, watched with the careful eye of a man trying to hold together forces that seemed intent on moving in opposite directions. The kingdom's relationship with the United States, which had been formalized through diplomatic channels and various agreements, deepened considerably during this period. American strategic interests in the Middle East had crystallized around Saudi Arabia as a stable, anti-communist anchor in a region growing increasingly volatile. The Soviet Union, after all, had shown its own imperial ambitions in the region, and Western powers viewed the House of Saud as essential to maintaining a counterbalance. This created an unspoken understanding, almost a tacit contract. America would provide security, military support, and diplomatic protection, while Saudi Arabia would guarantee stable oil supplies and strategic alignment. But what do you do with sudden, overwhelming wealth when your institutions are not yet equipped to manage it? The Saudi state faced this question acutely during the 1950s and early 1960s. The money flowed faster than it could be meaningfully spent, and certainly faster than the kingdom's traditional structures could absorb. Abdulaziz began channeling oil revenues into infrastructure projects, into the expansion of the military, into a slowly growing bureaucracy. He also began distributing wealth to his own family in increasingly elaborate ways, establishing patterns of patronage and entitlement that would define the dynasty for generations to come. The king's sons, now grown men with their own ambitions and visions, became principal beneficiaries of this oil wealth. They received land grants, business monopolies, and positions of influence within the state apparatus. This was not unusual in hereditary monarchies, but the scale and the velocity were unprecedented. Here was a family that had controlled modest resources in the 1930s, now commanding a kingdom whose annual oil revenues exceeded those of most European nations. The psychological and social implications were profound, though perhaps not fully recognized at the time. Yet there existed within the royal family and within the broader Saudi society a genuine desire to modernize, to build institutions that could rival those of the West while remaining rooted in Islamic principles. Abdulaziz himself, despite his traditional Bedouin background, had shown a pragmatic willingness to adopt technologies and structures that served the state's interests. He had already established the first schools beyond the Quran-based institutions that had dominated education for centuries. He had created a small but functional government bureaucracy. Now, with oil wealth as fuel, the vision of a modern Saudi Arabia seemed increasingly plausible. Yet modernity, as history repeatedly demonstrates, is not a simple matter of adopting new technologies and building new structures. It requires shifts in attitudes, in social hierarchies, in the way people understand themselves and their place in the world. The influx of Western workers and Western capital during the oil boom years began this slow, uncomfortable transformation. Women in the cities, watching Western wives of oil company executives, began to question certain restrictions. Young Saudis exposed to Western education began to contemplate ideas about governance and individual rights that sat uneasily with absolute monarchy. The clerical establishment, always the guardian of Islamic orthodoxy, grew increasingly anxious about these incursions of foreign influence. By the time Abdulaziz entered his final years, the kingdom had become something neither entirely traditional nor entirely modern, suspended between two worlds. It was a state of profound contradiction, rich beyond measure, yet culturally conflicted, militarily strengthened, yet dependent on foreign protection, religiously rooted, yet increasingly shaped by secular economic forces. These tensions, rather than being resolved, would only deepen in the decades to come, creating the landscape upon which Abdulaziz's heirs would have to navigate. The question that hung in the air, unspoken but omnipresent, was whether the House of Saud could maintain its grip on this transformed kingdom, whether it could preserve its legitimacy and authority in a world where oil wealth had made old certainties obsolete and new possibilities seemed to arrive on every ship and aircraft from the West. By the late 1960s, the oil revenues were flowing into Saudi Arabia with an intensity that few nations had ever experienced, and yet the kingdom itself remained, in many ways, caught between two worlds. The modern infrastructure was beginning to rise: highways, airports, hospitals. But the traditional rhythms of Arabian life, the Bedouin heritage, the Islamic scholarship that had anchored the Saud family's legitimacy for centuries, these too continued to shape the culture of the realm. Faisal, who had assumed the throne in 1964, found himself navigating this peculiar tension with remarkable dexterity. He was a man of the old world and the new, simultaneously, austere in his personal habits, deeply devoted to Islamic law, yet willing to modernize the kingdom's institutions in ways that surprised many observers. Consider what he faced: the demands of a rapidly urbanizing population, workers flooding in from across the Arab world and beyond, the pressure to build hospitals and schools and universities at a pace that would have seemed impossible just a decade before. And all of this required not merely money, but vision. Faisal understood that oil wealth could vanish as quickly as it had appeared, or worse, it could create a hollow prosperity that left the kingdom vulnerable to the very instabilities it sought to prevent. He invested heavily in education, in the training of Saudi citizens to eventually replace the foreign engineers and technicians who were then running so much of the kingdom's enterprises. He also positioned the kingdom, with careful diplomacy, as a leader not just in the Arab world, but in the broader Islamic world, a guardian of Islam's holiest sites, a voice that mattered when questions of faith and politics intertwined. Yet beneath this facade of stability, tensions were gathering. The velocity of change was disorienting to many Saudis. Modernization seemed to arrive overnight, bringing with it Western films, Western music, Western ideas about gender and family, and the proper role of Islam in daily life. Conservative Islamic scholars grew uneasy. They wondered aloud whether the kingdom was losing its spiritual moorings in its rush to become wealthy and powerful. And there were other concerns too: economic anxieties among a growing middle class, frustrations among the more ideologically driven segments of the Arab population who saw Saudi Arabia as too close to Western interests, particularly the United States. The kingdom had declared itself officially aligned with the West during the Cold War, though this alignment was complex and often contradictory. Saudi leaders saw in the United States a stabilizing force, a counterweight to Soviet influence, and a potential guarantor of the kingdom's security. But this very closeness provoked criticism from Arab nationalists and Islamists alike, who viewed such relationships as a betrayal of Arab solidarity. Faisal's approach was to try to thread this needle, to maintain Western ties while also positioning Saudi Arabia as the defender of Arab and Islamic interests. This led to some of the most consequential foreign policy decisions of his reign. When the Arab-Israeli conflict erupted again in 1967, a war known as the Six-Day War, Saudi Arabia found itself once more forced to choose between its various identities and allegiances. The war itself was devastating for the Arab states involved, particularly Egypt and Syria, and for the Palestinian people who were further displaced by the conflict's outcome. Saudi Arabia, though not directly invaded, was deeply moved by the outcome, and Faisal responded by making a momentous decision that would echo through the decades to follow. He would use the kingdom's oil as a weapon, not militarily, but economically. If the West would not pressure Israel to make peace, if the United States would not act as an honest broker in the region, then perhaps Saudi Arabia could make the cost of Western inaction too high to bear. This thinking would eventually crystallize in the Arab oil embargo of 1973, but the seeds of that decision were planted in the aftermath of the Six-Day War, in Faisal's growing conviction that the kingdom's immense wealth gave it leverage that extended far beyond the Arabian Peninsula. It was a bold calculation, and one that would reshape not merely Saudi Arabia's role in the world, but the entire global economy. And as these ideas were forming in Faisal's mind, the nature of the Saudi state itself was evolving. The royal family, once a small group of brothers united around a shared father, was now a sprawling institution of thousands, with competing interests and ambitions. How would Faisal maintain unity among the princes? How would he prevent the enormous wealth that was flowing into the kingdom from fracturing the family's collective purpose? These questions hung in the air, unanswered, as the 1970s approached, a decade that would test the House of Saud in ways that even its most prescient members could scarcely have imagined. The comfort of certainty that had characterized the earlier oil era was beginning to crack, replaced by a more uncertain, more volatile world in which the kingdom's role was expanding but also more precarious. And in this shifting landscape, Faisal worked to solidify his vision of what Saudi Arabia could become, not merely wealthy, but influential, not merely modern, but authentically Islamic, not merely a nation, but a force in the world that others would have to reckon with. The machinery of the Saudi state, by the 1980s, had begun to move with a certain rhythm that was neither entirely modern nor entirely traditional, but something altogether unprecedented, a hybrid engine running on petrodollars and Wahhabi conviction in equal measure. King Fahd, who had assumed the throne in 1982, inherited an empire that had grown almost faster than any single mind could comprehend, and with that inheritance came a peculiar burden that few in human history have ever truly carried: the weight of managing both inconceivable wealth and the spiritual expectations of over 1 billion Muslims worldwide. Consider for a moment what it meant to govern in this particular climate. The oil boom of the 70s had not simply enriched Saudi Arabia, it had transformed the entire topology of global power. OPEC had flexed its muscles, and the world had responded with a mixture of fear and resentment. By the early 1980s, however, oil prices had begun their inevitable descent from those dizzying heights. The petrodollar recycling that had seemed infinite was suddenly finite, and yet the infrastructure investments made during the boom years were still unfolding, still demanding resources, still requiring management and oversight on a scale that had no real historical precedent in the Arabian Peninsula. The military, which had grown exponentially under previous regimes, now represented both a source of national pride and a potential vulnerability. Saudi Arabia had invested perhaps more heavily in military hardware than any nation its size in the modern world. American weapons systems, British naval vessels, French aircraft, the hardware of modern warfare had been purchased in quantities that reflected not so much military necessity as the burning desire to assert dominance in a region where Iran, under its new Islamic Republic, had become an increasingly assertive rival. The Iran-Iraq War, which began in 1980 and would consume the decade, created a strange dynamic of strategic alignment that Saudi Arabia navigated with careful ambiguity. On one level, the Saudis feared a successful Iran, feared the export of Khomeini's revolution, feared Shia ascendancy in the Gulf, feared the potential for internal destabilization among their own Shia minority population in the eastern province, who had actually staged significant uprisings in 1979 in the wake of the Iranian Revolution. On another level, however, they also feared a triumphant Iraq under Saddam Hussein, whose ambitions for regional dominance might prove equally threatening. So Saudi Arabia offered financial support to Iraq, becoming, in effect, a crucial lifeline for a nation at war, while maintaining official neutrality and hoping that neither side would emerge as a hegemonic power. This balancing act, however, came with consequences that rippled outward in ways that were not always immediately visible. By financing Iraq's war effort, Saudi Arabia was simultaneously strengthening its own military-industrial position in the region and creating relationships that would eventually come back to haunt the kingdom in ways that no one in the corridors of power in Riyadh could have fully anticipated. The world has a way of presenting bills long after the initial transaction has been forgotten. Domestically, the kingdom faced a different sort of pressure, one that touched on the very foundations of legitimacy upon which the Saudi state rested. The 1979 uprising by radical Sunni Islamists who had seized the Grand Mosque in Mecca represented not an external threat, but an internal one, and it raised uncomfortable questions about whether the House of Saud was truly fulfilling its religious mandate. The official Wahhabi establishment had largely endorsed the house as the custodian of Islam's holiest sites, but there were increasingly vocal elements within the broader Islamic movement who saw the kingdom's cozy relationships with the Western world as a betrayal of Islamic principles. This tension between modernization and Islamic authenticity was perhaps the defining psychological crisis of the Saudi state in this era. Urban Saudis, particularly those who had studied abroad or who worked in the oil industry, had been exposed to Western ideas and technologies and consumer culture in ways that would have been unimaginable 2 generations earlier. Women's education had expanded significantly, though women's participation in the public sphere remained tightly constrained by social convention and religious law. Shopping malls were beginning to emerge in Riyadh and Jeddah, offering not just commerce, but a new kind of social space. Television ownership had become commonplace, bringing both entertainment and international news into Saudi living rooms. And yet, at the same time, the religious establishment maintained enormous cultural influence. The Mutaween, the religious police, continued to enforce strict codes of public behavior. Cinemas were prohibited. Interest-bearing banking was forbidden by religious law, which had required the development of Islamic finance instruments that would allow capital accumulation to proceed without violating the Quranic prohibitions against riba. The Friday prayer remained a fundamental rhythm of life, and the call to prayer continued to pause commerce and conversation multiple times each day in every Saudi city and town. It was this simultaneity of forces, the forward momentum of oil-fueled modernity, colliding constantly with the inertia of religious tradition, that gave Saudi Arabia its peculiar character in the 1980s. The country was not choosing between these forces so much as trying to contain them both at once, like a pressure vessel holding 2 incompatible substances in temporary equilibrium. How long such equilibrium could be maintained was perhaps the silent question haunting the mind of every Saudi policymaker in this period. The oil boom that transformed the kingdom in those middle decades of the 20th century was not simply a matter of wells and refineries and ships carrying black liquid across the sea. It was, in a more fundamental sense, a collision between 2 entirely different visions of what a society could be, and the House of Saud found itself positioned in the precarious middle ground, trying to preserve the old while building the new. Aramco, the American oil company that discovered and developed the vast reserves beneath the Arabian Peninsula, brought with it not just technology and capital, but an entire philosophy of modernity that often clashed directly with the deeply conservative religious values that had formed the cornerstone of the Saudi state since its founding. The relationship between the Al Saud family and the fundamentalist Islamic movement known as Wahhabism had always been symbiotic, almost inseparable. Back in the 18th century, when Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab, a religious scholar, had formed an alliance with an ancestor of the modern Saudi ruling family, something profound had taken root. The idea that temporal power and religious authority could reinforce one another, that a kingdom could be built on strict Islamic principles, while simultaneously wielding the tools of statecraft and international diplomacy. Yet oil changed the mathematics of that balance in ways that no one in 1938, when the first commercial well came in, could have fully anticipated. Consider the practical problem facing King Ibn Saud as the oil revenues began to flow in earnest after World War II ended. He needed roads, hospitals, schools, government buildings, electrical systems, ports that could handle modern cargo vessels. These things required foreign expertise, foreign workers, foreign technology, and all of it carried with it foreign ideas about how to organize society, what was permissible, what was desirable. American engineers worked alongside Saudi laborers. Modern equipment arrived in the ports. The radio, that remarkable device that could broadcast the human voice across distances previously unimaginable, arrived in the kingdom. Cinema came too, or at least the threat of it. The traditional Islamic scholars, the ulema, watched these developments with growing unease, sensing in them a potential erosion of the very values that had legitimized the Al Saud dynasty in the first place. The tension was not abstract. It was written into concrete decisions that had to be made almost daily. Should women be allowed to work in the oil industry? Should alcohol be strictly forbidden throughout the kingdom, even in the compounds where foreign workers lived? Should the kingdom permit the establishment of Christian churches or synagogues for the expatriate communities that were increasingly essential to operating the modern economy? Each of these questions carried weight far beyond its immediate practical context. They were, in reality, questions about identity, about what kind of nation Saudi Arabia would become, about whether Islam would remain the unquestioned center of social life, or whether it would gradually recede into one sphere among many. King Ibn Saud, who ruled until his death in 1953, demonstrated a pragmatism that his more conservative subjects sometimes found troubling. He understood, perhaps better than any of his contemporaries, that oil wealth alone would not secure his dynasty's future. Rather, it would be the decisions he made about how that wealth was deployed, how the kingdom was modernized, how the inevitable tensions between tradition and change were managed. He allowed the creation of the Saudi Arabian Oil Company, Aramco, with its American management and its foreign workers. He accepted the establishment of hospitals modeled on Western medical practice. He even agreed to the construction of an airport at Jeddah, that ancient Red Sea port that had for centuries served as the gateway for pilgrims traveling to Mecca, now updated with the infrastructure needed to receive modern commercial aircraft. Yet he was careful, always, not to move so quickly or so dramatically that he alienated the religious establishment whose blessing had legitimized Al Saud rule for 2 centuries. He continued to refer to himself as the custodian of the 2 holy mosques, a title that emphasized his role as protector of Islam's most sacred sites. He ensured that Islamic law remained the foundation of the Saudi legal system. He maintained the requirement that all citizens be Muslim, or at least profess Islam. The oil wealth, in his view, was not an opportunity to abandon the tradition that had created the kingdom, but rather to strengthen it, to create a more powerful, more secure, more durable version of the Islamic state he had inherited. This balancing act became increasingly difficult as the decades progressed and the kingdom's oil revenues grew exponentially. The 1950s and 1960s saw dramatic increases in the sophistication of the Saudi state apparatus. A formal government structure began to take shape, with ministries, a bureaucracy, official channels of authority that looked increasingly like those of modern nation-states. The University of King Saud was established in 1957, offering instruction in everything from medicine to engineering to the liberal arts. Saudi students were sent abroad to study in American universities and European institutions, and they returned with ideas, with experiences, with a sense that there were alternative ways of organizing society beyond what they saw in their own kingdom. The wealth also created new social realities. A merchant class emerged, families who built fortunes in commerce and construction. The Al Saud royal family itself grew larger and more complex, as successive kings had multiple wives and produced dozens of sons, each of whom possessed royal blood and royal expectations. Palaces were constructed. Luxury items appeared in the cities. There were whispers, carefully quiet whispers, about the lifestyle of certain princes who seemed to have adopted habits that the most strict interpreters of Islamic law would have found troubling. The contrast between the public image of Saudi Arabia as a deeply religious state and the private conduct of those with access to vast wealth became, for some observers, increasingly difficult to overlook. Yet the kingdom remained, on the surface, exceptionally conservative. Women were confined by laws that restricted their movements, their ability to work, their freedom in ways that became increasingly anachronistic as the 20th century progressed. The religious police, the mutawa, patrolled the streets enforcing Islamic standards of dress and conduct. Certain forms of entertainment were forbidden, certain books were banned, certain ideas were considered not merely wrong but dangerous, potentially corrupting to the Islamic society that the state was explicitly committed to maintaining. For foreigners working in the kingdom, the experience was often one of profound cultural dissonance. Living in a modern infrastructure of hospitals and airports and government offices, yet operating within a social framework that seemed determined to preserve medieval standards of religious observance and personal conduct. How, one might wonder, could a modern state maintain such contradictions indefinitely? How could a kingdom invest so heavily in the machinery of modernity while simultaneously enforcing religious codes that seemed designed to resist modernity at every turn? The answer, from the perspective of the Al Saud family, was that they had no choice but to try. The oil wealth had created new possibilities, but it had also created new vulnerabilities. The kingdom was now integrated into a global economy. It was dependent on foreign expertise and foreign trade. Its stability was increasingly a matter of international significance, something that the United States in particular monitored with intense interest. Yet the legitimacy of Al Saud rule, the thing that held the kingdom together from within, remained rooted in Islam, in the covenant between the family and the religious establishment, in the claim that they were defending and promoting the true faith against the encroachments of secular modernity. The solution, such as it was, involved a kind of careful choreography. On the surface, the kingdom maintained an image of strict Islamic propriety. The laws remained severe. The religious courts continued to hand down sentences that seemed harsh to outside observers. The dress codes remained restrictive. But behind the scenes, in the palaces and the villas and the private compounds, a different reality unfolded. Princes traveled abroad and experienced the freedoms and pleasures of Western culture. Families built networks of international business interests. Money flowed outward in investments and acquisitions. The Al Saud dynasty was becoming, in effect, two different things simultaneously: a deeply Islamic monarchy for public consumption and a sophisticated international business empire operating according to the logic of global capital. This duality, this fundamental tension at the heart of the Saudi state, would shape everything that came later. It would influence how the kingdom responded to the great ideological struggles of the Cold War. It would determine how the Al Saud family navigated the emergence of Arab nationalism and the various challenges to absolute monarchy that swept through the Middle East in the 1950s and 1960s. It would condition the choices made when new crises emerged, new threats appeared, new opportunities presented themselves. The oil wealth had created a kingdom that was powerful beyond what anyone might have imagined in 1932, when Abd al-Aziz first claimed the empty desert and the holy cities. But that same wealth had also created a fundamental paradox that would require endless management, endless negotiation, an almost impossible balancing act to maintain. By the 1970s, Saudi Arabia had become something the world had never quite seen before, a nation transforming almost faster than its own citizens could comprehend. Oil revenues were flooding in at rates that seemed almost incomprehensible, and the question that occupied the minds of King Faisal and his brothers was not whether they had enough wealth, but what to do with it. They possessed, in essence, the financial equivalent of an ancient king's treasure chest that never emptied, and with that abundance came both extraordinary possibility and a peculiar kind of paralysis. The architecture of the kingdom was changing visibly. Where once there had been sand and sparse settlements, there now rose highways, universities, hospitals, and apartment complexes. Yet this physical transformation was merely the surface manifestation of something far deeper, a civilization attempting to modernize without fracturing under the weight of its own contradictions. The Saudi leadership understood that they could not remain forever in the simplicity of their father's generation, yet they also could not abandon the religious and tribal values that formed the foundation of their legitimacy. King Faisal, who had steered the nation through the 1960s, was a man of quiet intensity. Unlike some of his more flamboyant brothers, Faisal carried himself with an ascetic bearing that earned him respect across the Islamic world. He was deeply religious in a personal way, not performative, but genuinely contemplative, and he believed that the kingdom's rapid enrichment came with a moral obligation. Can a nation change the way it thinks about itself without losing something essential in the process? This was the question that seemed to haunt the deliberations of Saudi leadership during these years. The oil boom meant that the kingdom could build, and it did, at a pace that astonished foreign observers. But building required people, and Saudi Arabia did not have nearly enough skilled laborers, engineers, and technicians within its own borders. This created one of the kingdom's defining characteristics in the late 20th century, an extraordinary reliance on foreign workers. By the mid-1970s, construction sites across the country employed Egyptians, Palestinians, Yemenis, Indians, and Filipinos. The slow, patient work of building a nation became a multinational enterprise, and the demographic character of Saudi cities began to shift in ways that would have consequences no one fully anticipated. Within this context of rapid change and external influx, the royal family itself was expanding and differentiating. By the 1970s, King Faisal had numerous adult sons who had been educated in the West, many of whom held ministerial positions. The second-generation princes, many of whom had attended universities in the United States or Europe, began to form their own views about how the kingdom should develop. Some were more progressive, more comfortable with Western influence and technological adoption. Others were more conservative, concerned that rapid modernization was eroding Islamic values. These tensions within the family mirrored tensions within Saudi society itself, and they would eventually come to a critical point. The oil embargo of 1973, which came as a response to the Arab-Israeli War, had been a pivotal moment not just for Saudi Arabia, but for the entire world. When the kingdom joined other Arab states in restricting oil exports to nations supporting Israel, the geopolitical landscape shifted fundamentally. The Western world, suddenly anxious about energy security, began to treat Saudi Arabia with a deference that had previously been reserved for far larger or more militarily powerful nations. For the first time, the kingdom realized the full extent of its leverage. Oil was not merely a commodity, it was leverage over the entire global economy. This realization came with both power and burden. The United States, which had been maintaining a careful distance from Arabian affairs, suddenly became more attentive. Agreements began to be negotiated, understandings reached. There is a certain quality to the moment when a nation realizes that it can dictate terms rather than merely accept them, and Saudi Arabia experienced that shift in the early 1970s. The psychology of the leadership changed. They were no longer a peripheral kingdom on the edge of the Arab world. They were central. Yet with this newfound power came new anxieties. If oil made the kingdom rich and influential, what would happen when oil eventually declined in importance? This was perhaps the first moment when serious Saudi thinkers began to contemplate the long arc of their nation's future. They could not assume, despite their vast reserves, that the world would depend on their oil forever. Technology was advancing, alternative energy sources were being explored, and the world's appetite for energy, while growing, was not infinite. This awareness, which might sound premature to an outside observer, was actually quite prescient. The social fabric of the kingdom was experiencing strain from multiple directions simultaneously. Wealth was entering the country at rates that the traditional social structure could scarcely absorb. A merchant family that had been comfortable but not wealthy suddenly found itself extraordinarily rich. A young person who might have expected to follow their father's trade as a traditional craftsman now had access to education that could lead them into completely different fields. The old certainties were dissolving, and new ones had not yet formed. What does a society do when the ground beneath it shifts so completely that the maps drawn by previous generations no longer correspond to reality? The educational infrastructure of the kingdom was expanding rapidly. Universities were being established. Scholarship programs were sending thousands of Saudi young people abroad to study in American and European institutions. These students returned to their homeland with ideas, perspectives, and sometimes doubts about traditional arrangements. They had seen how women lived in Western countries, had witnessed different models of governance, had been exposed to philosophies that questioned religious orthodoxy. Could a society modernize without its citizens being changed by that modernization? The question seemed almost naive in retrospect, yet it was genuinely being asked by policymakers who hoped that development could be carefully controlled and compartmentalized. In the background of all this rapid transformation, the connection between the House of Saud and the Wahhabi religious establishment remained as strong as it had been since the 18th century alliance between Muhammad ibn Saud and Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab. But now that relationship was being tested in subtle ways. The religious scholars who had once lived relatively quietly in the kingdom were finding themselves navigating a landscape that was changing faster than their theological frameworks could easily accommodate. How does a traditional religious institution maintain its authority when the society it serves is undergoing revolutionary economic and social change? This became one of the central tensions that would define the coming decades of Saudi Arabian history. The American military and intelligence presence in the kingdom was also increasing during these years, though it remained largely invisible to ordinary citizens and even to many observers outside the region. The Cold War was still a dominant feature of global politics, and the United States saw Saudi Arabia as a crucial piece in its strategic calculations regarding the Middle East and the broader contest with the Soviet Union. This deepening entanglement between Washington and Riyadh was something the Saudi leadership navigated carefully, aware that excessive closeness to the Americans could be used as ammunition by critics who opposed Western influence. It was a delicate balance, one that required constant attention and diplomatic skill to maintain. As the 1970s continued to unfold, the kingdom seemed to rest in a peculiar state of suspension, growing richer by the day, yet somehow uncertain about what it wanted to become. The oil beneath the desert had transformed the family's fortunes in ways that seemed almost inconceivable to those who had known the hardship of the earlier years. Yet with that immense wealth came a complexity that no amount of gold or crude could simply dissolve. By the 1970s, as the global economy began to orbit around petrodollars, the question facing King Faisal and his advisors was not whether Saudi Arabia was rich, that had become undeniable, but rather what it meant to be a custodian of such power in a world that was changing at a pace that made the previous century feel leisurely by comparison. The kingdom had begun to construct cities where only sand had existed before. Vast urban complexes rose from the desert floor, their gleaming facades reflecting wealth that previous generations would have considered mythical. Yet the speed of this transformation created its own kind of friction, a tension between the traditions that had anchored the Saudi state since its founding and the inevitability of modernization. The ruling family found itself in a curious position, simultaneously guardians of the Islamic holy cities and operators of one of the world's most advanced industrial and technological infrastructures. Faisal's vision for the kingdom was not simply to accumulate riches, though riches certainly accumulated, but to position Saudi Arabia as a stabilizing force in a region that had become increasingly volatile. The 1960s had witnessed the rise of Arab nationalism, movements that celebrated secular progress and challenged the authority of traditional monarchies. Faisal understood, with a kind of quiet intensity that defined his approach to governance, that oil wealth could serve as both shield and sword. It could fund development that would modernize the kingdom and cement the family's legitimacy with their own people, while also allowing them to project influence across the Muslim world and beyond. This is where the story begins to touch upon something that would define the late 20th century for the kingdom: the intricate dance between religious authority and state power. Faisal had cultivated a deep partnership with the religious establishment, the ulema, the scholars and clergy, who held sway over how Islam was interpreted within Saudi borders. This relationship was not new, of course. It traced back to the original pact between Muhammad ibn Abd and Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab in the 18th century. But Faisal had revitalized it in a way that served both parties. The religious leadership gained resources and institutional support that allowed them to maintain their influence in an increasingly modern world, while the crown gained religious legitimacy for its rule and its decisions. It was a bargain struck not in a single moment, but over countless conversations and agreements, many of them never formalized in writing, existing instead in the realm of understanding and custom. The wealth flowing from the oil fields became, in a sense, the currency of this partnership. Faisal funded the expansion of religious institutions, the training of scholars, the construction of grand mosques, and the distribution of religious texts throughout the Muslim world. He also, and this is crucial to understanding the kingdom's evolution, became increasingly vocal about his interpretation of Islam as a counterweight to both communist influence from the Soviet Union and secular Arab nationalism emanating from Egypt and other neighboring states. By positioning Saudi Arabia as the guardian of authentic Islamic tradition, funded by its vast petroleum reserves, Faisal created a narrative that few in the Muslim world could challenge. The resources at his disposal made his religious vision, whatever its particular emphases and interpretations, enormously influential. Yet there were costs to this arrangement, costs that would not become fully apparent for decades. The partnership between the crown and the religious establishment meant that certain interpretations of Islamic law and practice became institutionalized, embedded not just in culture, but in the formal structures of the state itself. Religious police, a network of enforcers who monitored public behavior for compliance with religious codes, became instruments of this arrangement. Courts operated according to Islamic law, with all the strictness and consequences that implied. The kingdom was not a theocracy in the formal sense. The king held ultimate authority, but nor was it a secular state. It occupied a space that was unique, a hybrid system in which religious authority and state power had become so intertwined that separating them seemed almost impossible. The 1970s also witnessed the beginning of what historians sometimes call the Islamic Revival, a global movement in which Islamic identity and Islamic governance became increasingly appealing to growing numbers of believers across the Muslim world. There were many drivers of this revival: disillusionment with secular nationalism, a sense that Western-style development had failed to bring promised prosperity to many nations, a hunger for authenticity and tradition in a world that felt increasingly alienated and fragmented. Saudi Arabia, with its enormous oil wealth, its custodianship of Islam's holiest sites, and its explicit commitment to religious governance, found itself in a position to sponsor and shape this movement. Faisal, who died in 1975, had set the kingdom on a path that his successors would continue to follow, sometimes consciously, sometimes almost by default. What is worth pondering, as you consider the kingdom's trajectory during this period, is whether the partnership between oil wealth and religious authority was primarily a conscious strategy, or whether it emerged more organically from circumstance and opportunity. The evidence suggests elements of both. Faisal was undoubtedly shrewd in recognizing the utility of religious legitimacy as a source of power, yet he also seemed to hold genuine religious convictions of his own. The distinction between calculated politics and sincere belief is often blurred in the lives of statesmen, and perhaps impossible to fully untangle. What we can observe with certainty is that by the mid-1970s, the House of Saud had become not merely a dynasty of tribal origins who happened to control oil, but a global power whose influence extended far beyond its borders, carried outward through the mechanisms of religious authority, petrodollar diplomacy, and the soft power of being the guardian of Islam's most sacred spaces. The transformation of Saudi Arabia in the latter decades of the 20th century was not simply a matter of wealth accumulating in royal coffers. It was a deliberate, almost architectural reimagining of what a nation-state could become when oil revenue flowed without constraint into the hands of a centralized monarchy. Abdulaziz, the founder, had set the template: absolute authority paired with careful, if uneven, distribution of resources among the extended family and select allies. But by the time his sons inherited the throne, the scale of that wealth had become almost incomprehensible in human terms. Consider the sheer magnitude of what was happening beneath the surface. While the international world saw only headlines about oil prices and geopolitical maneuvering, inside the kingdom something far more intricate was unfolding. The Saud family had become not merely the rulers of a nation, but effectively a holding company unto themselves. They were investors, developers, patrons, and gatekeepers all at once. Every major infrastructure project, every significant business venture, every cultural institution bore their invisible fingerprint, not through official titles alone, but through the vast networks of wealth that connected them to virtually every meaningful economic transaction. The decades of the 1960s through the 1980s saw the construction of cities where none had stood before. Riyadh transformed from a walled town of perhaps 50,000 souls into a sprawling metropolis, its skyline suddenly punctuated with modern towers and government buildings. Jeddah, the port city on the Red Sea, became a hub of international commerce. But these were not organic growths. They were visions imposed from above, funded by oil revenues, built according to royal planning. It is perhaps worth noting that while modernization proceeded at a breathtaking pace in some domains, the social structure itself remained remarkably resistant to certain kinds of change. What makes this period particularly fascinating, from a historical perspective, is the tension it embodied. Saudi Arabia was being wired into the global economy at extraordinary speed. International corporations arrived, construction firms, consultants, engineers, drawn by contracts and the promise of vast sums. Expatriate workers began arriving in larger and larger numbers, not as colonial administrators in the traditional sense, but as laborers, technicians, and specialists. By the 1970s and 1980s, foreign workers comprised a significant percentage of the Saudi workforce in certain sectors. This created an unusual social dynamics, a country modernizing rapidly, integrating with global capitalism, yet maintaining social conservatism and religious authority as its core legitimating principles. How does one hold both simultaneously? The oil wealth also fundamentally altered the Saud family's relationship to its own legitimacy. In the earliest decades, Abdulaziz had ruled through a combination of tribal authority, personal charisma, and Islamic credentials. He had conquered the Hijaz and gained the title of custodian of the two holy mosques, a role of profound religious significance. But as decades passed, the capacity to provide material abundance became nearly as important as religious authority. The family could ensure that Saudi citizens enjoyed relatively low taxes, subsidized energy and food, and employment opportunities that often prioritized nationals over foreigners. This became the unspoken contract, obedience and acquiescence in exchange for material comfort and guaranteed prosperity. The succession of the kings during this era tells another subtle story. Saud ibn Abdulaziz, the eldest son, ruled from 1953 to 1964, but his reign is often remembered as indecisive and troubled by personal extravagance that alarmed even his own brothers. His younger brother Faisal was more forceful, more intellectually engaged with modernization, and more capable of commanding respect among the broader royal family. When Faisal took over, whether through coup or constitutional maneuver depends somewhat on one's interpretation, he brought a different energy to governance. He was less inclined toward indulgence, more focused on state building and strategic vision. Under his watch, from 1964 to 1975, Saudi Arabia became more deliberately integrated into international affairs. He cultivated relationships with the West, particularly the United States, while maintaining the country's religious credentials and its anti-communist posture. The partnership between Saudi Arabia and the United States, which had been initiated informally through earlier agreements about oil supply and American military assistance, deepened considerably during Faisal's reign. Both nations saw themselves as counterweights to Soviet expansion and influence in the Middle East. This was the Cold War framework through which their relationship was understood. From the American perspective, Saudi Arabia represented stability, oil access, and a bulwark against communist influence. From the Saudi perspective, the American alliance brought military hardware, technical expertise, and international legitimacy. Yet this partnership also created dependencies and complications that would ripple through the coming decades. Faisal's assassination in 1975, carried out by a member of the royal family itself, was a shock that reverberated through the kingdom and the world. It suggested that even within the tightly controlled royal circle, tensions and resentments could build to violent levels. His successor, Khalid ibn Abdulaziz, ruled until 1982, though his brother Fahd increasingly took on governing responsibilities as Khalid's health declined. And here we arrive at another crucial figure, Fahd ibn Abdulaziz, who would effectively control Saudi Arabia for the better part of 3 decades, first as crown prince and then as king. By the time Fahd's influence became dominant, the kingdom was entering a period of unprecedented challenges and opportunities. The oil boom had created the material abundance that kept the social contract intact, but it had also introduced destabilizing elements. Rapid modernization produced dislocation. Young Saudis educated abroad returned with ideas that sometimes conflicted with traditional authority. The presence of foreign workers and international corporations brought different values, different social practices, and different ways of thinking. The Iran Revolution of 1979, which toppled the Shah and created an Islamic republic across the Persian Gulf, sent shockwaves through Saudi Arabia. Here was another Muslim nation claiming religious authenticity and revolutionary fervor, suggesting that perhaps the Saud family's approach to Islam, more conservative, more traditional, tied to monarchy rather than revolution, might be vulnerable to challenge. These pressures would shape the strategic choices of Saudi Arabia through the 1980s and beyond, even as the oil revenues continued to provide the financial cushion that made those choices possible. The billion-dollar question, in a very literal sense, was how to maintain absolute authority in a nation being transformed by forces that were increasingly difficult to control through traditional methods. How does a monarchy manage modernity while preserving its religious mandate and its political control? The transformation of the kingdom's relationship with the Western world deepened considerably as the 20th century moved forward, and with it came a peculiar paradox that would shape generations to come. On one hand, the Saudi rulers had found themselves increasingly dependent on foreign expertise, foreign capital, and foreign military protection to maintain their newfound dominion over one of the world's most consequential resources. On the other hand, they remained acutely conscious of their role as custodians of Islam's holiest sites, a responsibility that demanded they maintain a certain spiritual authenticity even as their palaces grew more luxurious and their bank accounts swelled beyond the comprehension of ordinary humans. This tension, this quiet pulling in two directions at once, became woven into the very fabric of Saudi society during the mid-20th century. Think for a moment about what it must have felt like for a desert prince, raised on stories of tribal honor and religious devotion, to suddenly find himself navigating the corridors of international finance, signing contracts written in English, shaking hands with men in tailored suits whose entire worldview rested on principles quite foreign to his own upbringing. The culture shock was immense, though rarely spoken of openly, and it created a kind of psychological strain that would echo through Saudi policymaking for decades to come. By the 1950s and 1960s, oil revenues had begun flowing in truly staggering quantities. The Arabian American Oil Company, or Aramco as it became known, had established itself as perhaps the most powerful corporate entity in the Middle East, and its executives held considerable sway over how the kingdom's most precious resource was managed and distributed. The relationship between the Al Saud family and Aramco was complex, almost symbiotic in nature. The oil company needed stability and access to the reserves. The Saudi government needed the technical expertise and the international connections that only such a corporation could provide. Neither party could simply dismiss the other, and so they learned to dance together in a complicated choreography that would define an entire era. Yet within this arrangement lay seeds of resentment and anxiety that occasionally surfaced in unexpected ways. There were whispers among some Saudi intellectuals and nationalists who questioned whether their kingdom was truly sovereign or whether it had merely exchanged colonial masters for a different kind of foreign overlord, one whose dominion was economic rather than explicitly political. These murmurs never reached the level of outright rebellion, partly because the extraordinary wealth flowing into Saudi coffers allowed the ruling family to distribute largesse among the population, buying loyalty and quelling dissent through carefully calibrated patronage. But they existed nonetheless, a quiet undercurrent of concern about national independence and cultural preservation. During this same period, the Arab-Israeli conflicts of 1948 and beyond cast long shadows across the Arabian Peninsula and the broader Middle East. Saudi Arabia found itself pulled into regional politics in ways that previous generations had not experienced, suddenly expected to take positions on matters of Palestinian rights, Israeli statehood, and Arab solidarity. The kingdom's leaders walked an increasingly precarious tightrope, attempting to maintain their close relationship with the United States, which was itself deeply committed to Israel's security and survival, while simultaneously needing to respond to the passions of their own population and the expectations of other Arab nations. This delicate balancing act required enormous diplomatic skill and a willingness to make compromises that pleased no one entirely, which is precisely the mark of any successful middle power navigating between larger forces. The economic prosperity of the oil boom years also began to accelerate social changes that had been developing more slowly in earlier decades. Young Saudis were increasingly sent abroad for education, particularly to universities in Europe and North America, where they encountered ways of living and thinking that differed profoundly from what they had known at home. Some returned home with revolutionary ideas about social organization, democratic participation, and women's rights. Others came back with an intensified commitment to traditional Islam, having experienced what they perceived as the spiritual emptiness of Western material culture. The kingdom, in other words, was beginning to fracture along ideological lines, even as its wealth and international prominence continued to rise. Does a nation ever experience modernization without simultaneously experiencing the strain of conflicting visions about what modernity actually means? The oil wealth also transformed the physical landscape of Saudi Arabia in dramatic fashion. Where there had been small trading posts and agricultural settlements, suddenly there arose modern cities with high-rise buildings, paved roads, electricity, running water, and all the infrastructure of a 20th century state. Jeddah and Riyadh underwent particularly dramatic transformations, their skylines reshaping themselves almost year by year as construction cranes became permanent fixtures. This physical modernization was often presented as a triumph, and in many material respects, it genuinely was. The provision of clean water, sanitation, and electricity represented real improvements in the lives of ordinary Saudis. Yet there was also something disorienting about the pace of change, something unsettling about the speed with which the familiar world of one's parents and grandparents could be replaced by something that resembled a place one might see in a Western magazine. The traditional Bedouin way of life, which had defined Arabia for countless centuries, began to fade more rapidly during these decades. The nomadic pastoralists who had once roamed the desert according to the dictates of weather and water sources found themselves increasingly pushed to the margins of an economy that no longer valued their skills or their way of organizing society. Some were drawn into the emerging oil industry, taking jobs in the petroleum sector. Others settled in the growing towns and cities, attempting to adapt to urban life in ways that often proved deeply difficult. The loss of this ancient pattern of living represented a kind of cultural rupture, a breaking of continuity with the past that was particularly sharp given how recently it had been the dominant way of life across Arabia. Within the Al Saud family itself, generational tensions began to emerge with increasing clarity during this mid-century period. The older princes, who had known the hardships of creating a kingdom from fractured tribal territories, generally took a more cautious approach to modernization and Western engagement. The younger generation, educated abroad and exposed to contemporary international affairs, often pushed for more rapid change, and sometimes questioned the absolute authority of their elders in ways that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. These tensions were never allowed to become fully public, of course, but they manifested in subtle shifts in policy, in the occasional replacement of one official with another, in the slow evolution of how decisions were made at the highest levels of government. How does any institution navigate the shift from one generation to the next without losing its fundamental character, without becoming something unrecognizable to those who built it? The religious establishment within Saudi Arabia, particularly the Wahhabi scholars who had been instrumental in the kingdom's founding and early consolidation, found themselves in an increasingly complex position as well. They had been the spiritual legitimators of Al Saud authority for centuries, offering religious sanction for the family's rule in exchange for protection and patronage for their religious institutions and teachings. Yet as the kingdom became more deeply embedded in a secular international system, as Western influence permeated more aspects of daily life, some of these scholars grew troubled by what they perceived as a dilution of Islamic values. They worried that material prosperity was leading to spiritual complacency, that Western ideas were undermining the moral foundations of Saudi society. These concerns would eventually crystallize into more formal critiques and movements, but for now, they remained largely expressed through sermons, private conversations, and the careful control of education and media to emphasize Islamic teachings and values. There was a reflexive quality to much of Saudi policy-making during this period, a constant reassessment and recalibration of how to simultaneously embrace the material benefits of modernity while maintaining the spiritual and cultural identity that made Saudi Arabia distinct from the Western nations whose technology and capital it was importing. This wasn't necessarily a problem to be solved, so much as a condition to be managed, and the Al Saud family proved remarkably adept at managing it, at least during these particular decades when oil revenues were still rising and the international order seemed relatively stable and predictable. The specific formulas that worked during the 1950s and 1960s, however, were destined to face far more severe tests in the years that followed, when circumstances would shift in ways that no one, no matter how prescient, could have fully anticipated. And so, through the decades of the 70s and 80s, the kingdom found itself standing at an extraordinary crossroads. The oil revenue had become not just abundant, but almost incomprehensible in its scale, money flowing in at rates that no traditional economy had ever needed to manage before. Yet with that immense wealth came a weight of expectation, a pressure that transformed the nature of the Saudi state itself. The modernization that had begun under King Faisal accelerated under his successor, King Khalid, who reigned from 1975 through 1982. Though Khalid was technically the sovereign, much of the actual governance fell to his brother, Crown Prince Fahd, a figure who would become instrumental in shaping the kingdom's trajectory during its most transformative decades. Fahd possessed a vision, sometimes visionary, sometimes reckless, always ambitious, for what Saudi Arabia could become if it dared to dream at the scale its newfound wealth permitted. The cities themselves began to transform in ways that would have seemed almost mythical to those who had walked these same streets just a generation before. Jeddah, the coastal trading hub, was being rebuilt with modern infrastructure, gleaming towers rising where traditional markets had once stood. Riyadh, which had been little more than a provincial town just decades earlier, was becoming a metropolis almost overnight, with highways carved through the desert, airport terminals constructed, government ministries housed in ambitious new buildings. The pace was often dizzying, even frantic, as though the kingdom was racing against time itself. One might wonder, what propelled this particular moment of expansion? Part of it, certainly, was the rivalry with Iran that had intensified after the Islamic Revolution of 1979. The kingdom saw itself increasingly as the defender of Sunni Islam against Shia expansion, and this ideological competition manifested in material ways. Investment in infrastructure, in military capabilities, in religious institutions and universities, these became not merely development projects, but assertions of Saudi primacy in the Islamic world. The United States, meanwhile, had become an ever-present partner in this grand reconstruction. American engineering firms, American technology, American military advisors, all poured into the kingdom as part of a strategic alliance that had deepened significantly after the oil embargo of 1973 had demonstrated just how consequential Saudi energy reserves were to global stability. The Saudis, in turn, needed American expertise and military protection in a region that remained volatile and unpredictable. Yet there was something almost paradoxical about this relationship. A kingdom seeking to preserve its Islamic character while simultaneously importing Western technology, Western expertise, Western consumer goods. The tension was not merely political or economic, but cultural and spiritual. How could one maintain Islamic tradition while building cities that resembled those in California or Texas? How could one preserve the values of a desert people while surrounding them with air-conditioned shopping malls and modern hospitals? During this period, the Al Saud family itself was experiencing its own internal transformations. King Khalid, who suffered from health challenges throughout his reign, largely delegated authority to his circle of powerful princes. Fahd, as we noted, wielded significant influence. But there were also other brothers, Sultan, Naif, Salman, each commanding their own fiefdoms of authority, each with their own visions for how power and resource should be distributed. The House of Saud, despite its unity as a family enterprise, was never quite the monolith it appeared to be from the outside. One of the most consequential developments of this era, though it seemed almost routine at the time, was the systematic expansion of religious authority. The kingdom had always positioned itself as the guardian of Islam's holiest sites, but now it began to use its oil wealth to extend Islamic influence globally. Saudi universities were built to train Islamic scholars. Mosques were funded across the Muslim world. Religious texts were printed and distributed. In some ways, this was a continuation of the historical alliance between the Al Saud family and the Wahhabi movement that had produced their legitimacy in the first place, but now backed by resources of almost unimaginable scale. The social fabric of Saudi society was shifting as well, though more slowly and with considerable resistance. Women were beginning, very gradually, to enter the workforce in certain sectors. Education for girls, which had been controversial just years before, was now becoming more normalized. These changes came incrementally, often driven more by practical economic necessity than by ideological commitment to reform. As the economy expanded, labor demands grew, and certain restrictions became impractical to maintain. And yet, the fundamental structures of gender relations, of religious authority, of absolute monarchical rule, these remained essentially unchanged. Picture, if you will, the contradiction embedded in daily life. A young woman in Riyadh might attend a university, earn a degree, even work in a government office. Yet she could not travel, could not marry, could not conduct basic legal transactions without the permission of a male guardian. A businessman might negotiate million-dollar contracts with American firms and wear European suits, yet he attended mosque regularly and observed the strict religious requirements of the faith. The kingdom, in this period, was not so much becoming Western as it was attempting something far more complex, absorbing Western technology and some Western practices while simultaneously reasserting Islamic identity as its core legitimating principle. The oil revenues themselves, it should be noted, were not evenly distributed, though the kingdom did develop welfare systems and did invest in public services. Much of the wealth accrued to the royal family itself. The Al Saud princes grew extraordinarily wealthy during this period, not merely wealthy in the conventional sense of having great fortunes, but wealthy in ways that allowed them to live at scales of consumption that would have astounded observers from earlier generations. Private jets, luxury compounds, international real estate holdings, the accumulation of wealth became, for the top tier of the Al Saud family, not merely abundant, but almost literally beyond counting. And all the while, the oil continued to flow. The reserves seemed inexhaustible. The technology for extraction became more sophisticated. The geopolitical significance of Saudi reserves only increased as global energy demands grew and as the kingdom's production capacity made it the swing producer of global markets, meaning that Saudi decisions about how much oil to pump could influence worldwide prices and, indirectly, global economic stability itself. The 80s would bring its own challenges and transformations: international tensions, economic fluctuations, succession questions within the royal family. All of these would demand response and adaptation. But in this moment, stretching through the late 70s and into the early 80s, the House of Saud appeared to have found a formula: use oil wealth to modernize infrastructure, strengthen military capacity, extend religious influence, and consolidate dynastic power. It was a formula that would hold, more or less, for decades to come, though not without strains that would eventually test even the deepest resources and most careful strategies. The transformation of Saudi Arabia during these decades was not merely one of oil wells and pipelines, though those things mattered greatly, but rather a kind of reshaping of time itself. What had once been a landscape where the rhythm of life followed the movement of camels and the seasons of the desert began to pulse instead with the meter of international commerce and the demands of the modern world. And yet, despite this profound change, the royal family sought to maintain something essential about their identity, some thread that connected them to their ancestors who had ridden across these same sands centuries before. King Faisal, who took control during a period of considerable turbulence in the 1960s, understood that wealth alone would not secure the kingdom's future. There needed to be a strategy, a vision that extended beyond the next oil shipment or the next dollar earned. He looked across the globe and saw nations strengthening themselves not only through resources, but through education, infrastructure, and the careful cultivation of allies. The expansion of the university system in Saudi Arabia during his reign reflected this thinking, the belief that human capital would prove as valuable as petroleum in the long journey ahead. What is perhaps most curious about this period is how the kingdom began to export not just oil, but influence. Through a careful orchestration of diplomatic relationships and economic partnerships, Saudi Arabia positioned itself as more than simply a wealthy nation sitting atop vast reserves. It became a player in regional politics, in the Arab world, in the broader Middle Eastern sphere of influence. The oil embargo of 1973, which many remember as a moment of economic shock for the Western world, was from the Saudi perspective something quite different. It was a demonstration of power, a statement that the kingdom could not be taken for granted or treated as a subsidiary to larger powers' interests. The decade following that embargo saw what economists would later call the first oil boom, though such clinical language does little to capture what it felt like for a nation to suddenly find itself swimming in liquid wealth. Billions of dollars flowed into Saudi coffers each year, and this required a kind of governance that had never been tested before. How does one spend, invest, and allocate resources on a scale that the human mind struggles to fully comprehend? The kingdom began massive infrastructure projects, highways that stretched across the desert, ports that would transform trade routes, hospitals and schools that appeared almost as if conjured from the sand itself. And yet, this rapid accumulation of wealth created its own complexities and tensions. For every dollar spent on modernization, there existed a philosophical question about whether modernization itself was compatible with the kingdom's religious identity and values. Could one have skyscrapers and airplanes while maintaining a strict adherence to Islamic law and tradition? Could education for women coexist with the traditional structures that had governed family and society for centuries? These were not merely technical questions to be resolved by engineers and planners, but profound tensions that would simmer beneath the surface of Saudi society for decades to come. The royal family, numbering in the thousands when one counted all the princes and their descendants, became extraordinarily wealthy in their own right. Some of them began to accumulate personal fortunes that rivaled the GDPs of small nations. This concentration of wealth within a relatively small circle of individuals created a kind of aristocracy within the aristocracy, a hierarchy of power and privilege that would shape the kingdom's politics in ways both subtle and profound. a prince with connections to the oil ministry, possessed advantages that even other princes might lack. A prince with control over a major construction contract could build a personal empire across the years. Meanwhile, the ordinary people of Saudi Arabia experienced this transformation in deeply personal ways. A young person born into a middle-class family in the 1970s might find themselves with educational opportunities their parents could never have imagined. They might travel abroad for university, learn languages, encounter ideas from across the globe. Yet when they returned to their homeland, they would still be subject to the laws and customs that governed behavior in ways quite different from the countries they had visited. This created a particular kind of tension within the society, a generation becoming cosmopolitan in outlook while remaining bound by local constraints. The relationship between the House of Saud and the religious establishment, particularly the Wahhabi scholars and clerics who had been partners in the kingdom's founding, deepened and complicated during this period. The state needed the religious authorities to legitimize its rule and maintain social order, especially as modernization accelerated. In turn, the religious establishment received significant resources and influence. This partnership meant that even as the kingdom modernized in some respects, building technology, industry, infrastructure, it could maintain and even strengthen its commitment to particular religious interpretations and practices. This balance, precarious as it often seemed, would prove one of the kingdom's most distinctive features. By the end of the 1970s, Saudi Arabia had transformed itself from a regional player into a global economic force. The kingdom was no longer simply subject to the whims of international oil markets or the policies of larger powers, but had become a force that shaped those markets and influenced those policies. Yet this transformation had also created new vulnerabilities and new challenges. The very wealth that had enabled the kingdom's rise could also become a source of instability if not managed with care and foresight. And the rapid modernization that had lifted the kingdom into the contemporary world had also exposed many Saudis to values and ideas that existed in tension with their traditional beliefs and practices. The stage was being set, in other words, for a series of events that would test the kingdom in profound and unexpected ways. And so we arrive at a place of pause, at a threshold where the light of the Najdi desert meets the glow of modern cities that rise where only sand once stretched endlessly beneath an infinite sky. The House of Saud, having traced an arc across nearly a century and a half of human history, stands now at a peculiar crossroads. Not at the beginning of their story, certainly, but perhaps at a moment where one long chapter closes and another, still unwritten, waits to unfold. What is it, we might ask in this quiet moment, that transforms a tribal confederation into a continental power? Is it the oil beneath the dunes, or is it something older than that, something woven into the very fabric of how a people choose to move through time, how they decide to hold on to certain truths while releasing others? The answer, perhaps, lies somewhere in between, in that vast and shadowed space where necessity and vision meet. Consider the weight of all that has come before, from the alliance forged between Muhammad ibn Abd and Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab in that dusty encampment, through the rise and fall and rise again of their domain, through wars both internal and external, through the discovery of black gold and its transformation of everything, there is woven a story of survival that asks much of those who inherit it. The House of Saud has learned, across these long generations, that power is never static. It requires constant attention, constant recalibration, constant choice about who you wish to become. We have watched them modernize, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes with great deliberation. We have seen them build skyscrapers from oil wealth, educate their young in universities both domestic and foreign, open their borders to the world while preserving what they consider sacred from it. These are not simple acts. They carry the weight of contradiction, the strain of holding opposing truths simultaneously, the ancient and the contemporary, the religious and the secular, the traditional and the radically new. There is something profoundly human in this struggle, is there not? In the effort to honor what came before, while acknowledging that the world has changed, that your children will inherit something different from what their grandparents knew, that the future demands new skills, new thinking, new ways of seeing possibility. The Saudis are not unique in this. All societies face it, but their resources, their influence, and their particular geography place them at a specific kind of crossroads. The oil will not last forever, though that day remains distant still. The economic models that once seemed so certain are being questioned and reshaped. The regional dynamics that seemed stable for decades have shifted beneath their feet. Climate change casts a shadow over deserts that have always been harsh but are becoming harsher. And yet, there is still innovation, still investment in new technologies, still a certain kind of stubborn persistence in the way this kingdom moves forward. One might reflect that the true measure of the House of Saud will not be found in the oil revenues of the past, nor even in the architectural marvels rising in Riyadh and Jeddah, but rather in how they navigate the decades to come. Will they manage the transition away from petrodollars with the same shrewd pragmatism that allowed them to consolidate power in the desert? Will they be able to preserve what matters most to them while adapting fully to a world that moves faster than it ever has? These questions hang in the air, unresolved, waiting. There is also something worth considering about the role of narrative itself in all of this. The House of Saud has told a story about itself, a story of guardians, of stewards of Islam, of modernizers and traditionalists in careful balance. Whether one believes that narrative or questions it, one must acknowledge its power. The stories we tell about ourselves and our institutions shape how people see us, how we see ourselves, what we believe possible. The next chapter of this kingdom's history will be written not only in economic policy and diplomatic cables and legislative decisions, but in the stories that its leaders choose to tell, and the stories that the world chooses to believe. As we come to the close of this long meditation on a family and a country and a century of transformation, there is perhaps a gentle wisdom in recognizing that this is not truly an ending at all. The House of Saud continues, the kingdom continues. The desert continues its patient, ancient witness to all that unfolds upon its surface. New rulers will come, new challenges will arise, new visions will be born in the minds of people yet unborn, who will inherit not only the riches and the power, but also the responsibility of deciding what to do with them. In the quietness of this moment, as we step back and let the full scope of the story settle around us like twilight, we might find ourselves considering what it means to build something that lasts, what it means to hold tradition and modernity in one hand, what it means to hold power across deserts and oceans and generations. The Saudis have done these things, imperfectly, with both vision and contradiction, with both generosity and cruelty, as all human enterprises have done. They are not villains in a simple narrative, nor heroes in a straightforward tale. They are what we all are, a people caught between the weight of history and the pull of the future, doing their best to navigate the impossible middle ground. And perhaps, in falling into sleep now, in letting the rhythm of all these names and dates and events dissolve gently into the background of your mind, you might carry with you not a neat conclusion, but rather a sense of how complex human power truly is, how the forces that shape nations and generations are never simple, how 1,000 decisions, made in the privacy of councils and palaces, ripple outward across continents and years, how one family's choices, made in the desert more than a century ago, echo still in the world we inhabit today. The Saudis will continue their journey, the kingdom will endure and transform and face its trials, and somewhere in the depths of the Arabian Peninsula beneath cities of glass and steel, the ancient sand remembers everything. Every tent that rose and fell, every caravan that passed, every moment of human ambition and human fragility played out beneath its patient, indifferent sky. Sleep well with this knowledge. Let it settle like dust, like peace.